We're now walking into the Texas execution chamber. This is where all the lethal injections in Texas have taken place over the last many years since 1982.
The state of Texas is preparing for an execution. It will be the 22nd in 2006.
My name is Michael Johnson. When we're on Texas death row, I'm 29. I'm here for capital murder.
The condemned man is Michael Dwayne Johnson.
My execution date's tomorrow.
In 24 hours, Johnson will be put to death for his role in the murder of a man named Jeff Wetterman.
Jeff was 6'7". He was a big guy, and he was just full of life. He had a great spirit, a big smile, and just a huge personality.
He was, just a gentle giant. He was the largest of the three brothers, but he was the most humorous and probably the most compassionate.
Jeff Wetterman's family has been waiting 11 years for justice. Now they will be making the trip to witness Michael Johnson's execution.
I'm gonna go to Huntsville, and hopefully we'll go in, and Michael Johnson will be put to death, and we'll all walk out of there okay.
There's 2 witnessing rooms for the inmate and victim's family. This first room nearest to the inmate's head is where the victim's family will stand and watch the execution, so that if the inmate turns, he's looking right at the victim's family. Right on the other side, separated by a wall, this is where the inmate's family is, so that when he looks down, he can see his own family assembled here. The 2 families never actually see one another interact, because certainly we don't want any kind of a conflict. They're already going through enough, there's already enough emotions there, and we keep them completely separate.
Michael Johnson's family is also making the trip to death row.
Well, we're just going down to a motel room to wait for my son to be executed, or as I like to say, murdered. I mean, that's the way I feel about it. I don't think people have the right to take life, even the state. They're just as guilty as the people they're killing. And since Michael had proof that he didn't do it, they're guiltier. That's all.
The Johnson family believes that Michael is innocent, but can they prove it in time to save his life?
We always have hope. Nothing is certain until it's done. Nothing. God works miracles.
Our state should be embarrassed that we're executing someone without giving them a fair trial.
Defense attorney Greg White will spend the next 24 hours working on emergency appeals to stay the execution.
And so we have papers sitting at the United States Supreme Court waiting to be decided. We have a petition for executive clemency waiting for Governor Perry to make a decision. And, we are alert to anything that might happen.
People every day that face the death penalty profess their innocence to the end, even in the face of overwhelming odds.
Mike Freeman helped prosecute Michael Johnson. He has no doubt the state got it right.
There was never any doubt. The evidence was overwhelmingly convincing that this dastardly deed was done by Michael Johnson.
Daybreak on Interstate 35 near the small town of Lorena, Texas. The lives of Jeff Wetterman and Michael Johnson are on a collision course.
I remember that morning, Jeff waking up and saying, "Oh no, I'm late,"
Jeff is late for work at his father's gas station, the Lorena Fast Time. Michael Johnson and a friend are joyriding down the freeway in a stolen Cadillac, their gas tank running on empty.
911, what's your emergency?
It's me. I work at the Lorena Fast Time in Lorena, Texas, and the kid that was helping me has just been shot by somebody that came up here and got gas and drove over.
Yeah, so he robbed you?
No, ma'am. He just they got gas, and I think they just took off with the gas. Oh, my God.
Out of all the homicides I've ever worked, this was the most senseless.
Detective Mike Nicoletti. It was his case.
Jeff was the type of individual that if someone came in and they needed a tank of gas and they had no money, he'd have given it to them.
Okay, was the person black or white?
young man with blonde hair. I didn't get a good look at him.
Was he by himself?
No, ma'am, there was somebody driving it. He got out and shot.
What does the car look like? What color?
A description of the car and the suspects hit the airwaves statewide. Within 24 hours, police got a tip from a confidential informant on the outskirts of Dallas.
2 individuals had been talking about committing a crime fitting the description of the one that had occurred in Lorena. The names of these 2 individuals were Mike and David, was the only thing the informant knew. But he did give their street that they lived on.
Police follow the lead to the 5200 block of Edgeworth Drive. They find the stolen Cadillac parked in a lot on the corner. Down the block, they find the front door of Michael Johnson.
I had my headphones on in my room, and my dad come in and said, the police right there. They're looking for you, right?
Johnson flat told me that he hadn't been anywhere, for the last few days. He'd been staying at his house and never left.
Didn't tell him nothing. Told him I was at home. I don't know nothing. My brother's been to prison. He spent like 20 years in prison. I got some cousins been to prison. I knew when you first don't say nothing about nothing, and you don't never snitch on anybody.
The same day, police put the color on the second suspect, 17-year-old David Vest.
Vest, complete opposite end of the spectrum from Johnson. As we're walking out the house with him, he's already trying to tell us what happened.
David Vest gave up a detailed statement, pointing the finger at Michael Johnson.
He told me that he was celebrating his birthday, that Johnson had suggested that they go to the coast in the stolen Cadillac that they had possession of. When they got to the south side of Waco, they realized they didn't have any gas, and they had about $4 between them. Johnson and Vest pulled into this drive and pulled up to the far end of these pumps. Vest got out of the car, pumped the gas. The last thing in the world they expected was for someone working in the convenience store to come outside and just engage them in conversation. Vest said what was going through his mind was, what are we going to do to steal this gas? This is a pretty big guy, and when Vest finishes pumping the gas, he hangs the nozzle up, and Johnson shoots Wetterman in the face. Vest said he was as shocked as anybody. He didn't realize he was going to do that. Matter of fact, in my interview with Vest, he said that after the shooting had taken place, he had broke down and cried because he was so scared, and Johnson made fun of him.
The prosecution's key witness, David Vest, swore in to testify against his good friend, Michael Johnson.
Vest cut a deal with the state, 8 years for aggravated robbery, in exchange for his testimony against Michael Johnson.
Vest told the court how he and Johnson got the 9mm Ruger used in the shooting.
David Vest wasn't the only one talking. Friends of Johnson and Vest testified that Johnson had bragged about committing the murder.
Michael Johnson told them that he had shot a man in the head, a gas station attendant, and that he dropped like a rock. And he laughed about it. He thought it was funny.
At trial, Johnson kept his mouth shut. His defense maintained he never even made the road trip with David Vest.
Yeah, well, that was my lawyers. They come up with this alibi saying I wasn't even there. And so they put it on. But then at the end, they kind of changed it and started talking about, well, even if he was there, it couldn't have happened this way. And they were right that it couldn't have happened the way they were saying. But it just made us look like we were full of shit. That's what it did.
DNA linked Johnson to the stolen Cadillac, and surveillance video showed Vest and Johnson together on the road on the day of the murder.
They got him in the car. They got him videotaped down in different areas. He was there. There's no doubt about it.
Sheila Roberson was one of 12 called upon to decide Michael Johnson's fate.
No doubt it's a horrible decision to make, but that was our job to do, and we were given that job, and we had to follow through.
When the punishment was read, Johnson's mother stood up and yelled her son's name. Johnson then screamed obscenities to the jury and Wetterman's family as he was escorted to jail.
I was pissed because that whole courtroom was quiet and everybody's staring at you. You know what I'm saying? I was mad already. My mother was crying. That made me mad.
My son didn't do it. The guy killed him. Something he didn't do. That's murder too.
Michael Johnson's family, grief-stricken, continue to claim their son is innocent. Jeff Wetterman's family was crying as well, but only out of joy.
Just to hear the guilty verdict was what we needed, was what I needed.
We're glad that justice has been served, but we're all still very brokenhearted
and it's going to take us a while to heal. And I had never given capital punishment a thought before. That was the last thing that I had ever, before this happened to me. But I feel like, Michael Johnson chose to do this. He chose to steal the gas. He chose to take the trip to the coast. He chose to shoot Jeff. So he has involved me in this. And I had to watch Jeff die. And I will be there when he takes his last breath.
After 11 years of waiting, it now appears that Michael Johnson's last breath is only 24 hours away.
Yeah. I mean, it sucks. I'd rather not do it, but yeah, I'm ready.
But the condemned man still has one card left to play. On the eve of execution, he is claiming that David Vest is the real killer, and Johnson's lawyer says he has proof.
I knowingly caused bodily injury to Jeff Wetterman by shooting him with a handgun. Signed, David Noel Vest.
A confession by Vest? Signed in the presence of the prosecutor and the judge?
I don't believe we ever seen this.
Roberson is right. The jury didn't see it. Why not? Will this piece of paper be enough to stop an execution?
My name is Trish Wetterman McLean, and my husband Jeff was murdered by Michael Johnson in September of 1995.
The wife of a murder victim is waiting for justice. It's been more than a decade since her husband was gunned down.
This is our wedding album.
Trish and Jeff married in August of 1995. 3 weeks later, Jeff was dead, and Trish was a widow.
Jeff and I had dated for 4 years, and we were married for 3 weeks when he was killed. We'd been back from our honeymoon about a week and a half. These are the pictures that we got back after Jeff was buried. So he was never able to see them.
Now Trish is planning to witness the execution of the man convicted of Jeff's murder.
I feel that I need to see this through. That, I wasn't going to let 5 or 10 years go by and just forget that it ever happened. And for Jeff's sake, I feel that it's my duty. So that, I don't know, he knows that we haven't forgotten.
It looks like at this point that he will be executed at 6 o'clock tomorrow night.
Mike Nicoletti will be with Trish inside the prison, in part to honor a promise he made to her late father.
He engaged me in conversation one day about the process, how long it could actually take for Tricia to have to go through all this. And he told me that if anything ever happened to him, would I see her through all this? I don't know that she feels this way, but I almost feel like I'm stepping in as to be that father figure for her too, because of the promise that I made to her dad. So I intend to do that.
Now the cop and the widow are only 24 hours away from a promise fulfilled.
I seriously never thought I'd end up here, but I did.
But Michael Johnson says the state is making a big mistake. According to Johnson, it was his co-defendant, David Vest, who murdered Jeff Wetterman.
Bam, and that's when I hear the gunshot, and I jerk away. And he jumps in the car and pulls it in gear. And he's hollering, go, go, so I go. And we get on the highway. And as we're going, I said, what did you do? And so he says, I shot that dude. I said, who? And he says, the dude at the station. I was like, whatever. I didn't believe him. I thought he was just talking. So we get on down the highway.
Could Johnson's version of events possibly be true? Attorney Greg White seems to think so.
Danny, this is Greg White down in Texas. Michael Johnson case. What do you know?
White believes he has proof that Johnson was not the shooter.
Uh-huh.
He's calling on the U.S. Supreme Court to stop the execution.
Uh-huh. He is not guilty of what he's charged with. He is not guilty of the things that give rise to the death penalty. There's no different light to take this in.
The crux of White's case is this
David
piece of
Vest.
paper.
There's his name. I'm pleading guilty. I am guilty.
It's a confession brought to light by a friend to the condemned.
My name is Ward Larkin. I'm just unconditionally opposed to capital punishment. That's how I've gotten involved with getting to know guys on death row.
Larkin got to know Michael Johnson and began actively investigating his case.
So I went up to Waco and looked through his case files and his co-defendant's case file, and that's when I found the co-defendant's confession.
Larkin discovered David Vest's signature on the document that has called Michael Johnson's case into question.
This is a sworn confession. He says right in it, I shot Jeffrey Michael Wetterman. And I know the circumstances of the crime because there was only one shot fired. There was one gun at the scene and one shot was fired. Ergo, only one of them could be the shooter. So if David Noel Vest is saying I was the shooter, then that meant Michael wasn't.
At first glance, Vest's confession appears to support Michael Johnson's claim of innocence, but it was never entered into evidence at Johnson's trial.
And not only was it a confession, it was one that was sworn to, had an official file mark on it, had the judge's signature on it. There was no question but that it was authentic and that it had been sponsored by and written by the district attorney's office.
Prosecutor Mike Freeman says the confession is not what White claims.
The state of Texas did away with all distinctions between principals and accessories, and so it's necessary to allege that David Vest did shoot Jeffrey Wetterman. Well, this was State's Exhibit 62, which is the negotiated plea entered into between...
According to Freeman, state law compelled Vest to confess to all aspects of the crime, even though he didn't pull the trigger.
And we in the legal world realize that that is just a technicality, that it was pleading him as a party to the offense, not the shooter.
You know, and maybe that's right. And maybe a jury would believe him when they said that. But a jury might have believed that David Vest was a liar, because at one point he said that he shot the victim, and then he's on the witness stand saying something completely different. Who gets to decide that? Most people would say, well, put it all in front of the jury and let them decide.
Greg White's most serious charge is that prosecutors knowingly withheld the confession.
You're supposed to look at all the evidence, not pieces of the evidence.
Sheila Roberson was one of 12 jurors who found Michael Johnson guilty of capital murder.
You know, two wrongs don't make a right. And if you're going to put somebody to death, you better make sure you get the right one.
Today, Roberson is seeing David Vest's confession for the first time.
I don't believe we ever seen this. I don't believe this was a piece of evidence that I've ever seen before. So I don't know what to make of it, to tell you the truth.
Proof, according to White, that prosecutors buried the confession. But the state says Johnson's defense lawyers never asked for it.
This document was in public records, in open records. Anybody could have seen it. In fact, one of Michael Johnson's own attorneys was in the courtroom when the plea was taken. He certainly had access to it. He had access to our files at all times. That was not suppressed, and I think that gentleman knows better.
The confession has raised enough doubt to delay Johnson's execution for 3 years, but not enough to overturn his conviction. And today he is but 1 day away from execution.
They get caught up in these little legal rules to such an extent that they lose sight of the fact that that man confessed to shooting that guy. And so they're trying to kill me tomorrow, and they're saying, but that's okay, because these little technical rules, you should have found it soon. Even though we hid it from you, you should have found it. So it's like, man, it's like you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't.
Does it bother you that I continue to call you about this? Okay, all right.
Greg White has now taken his appeal to the highest court in hopes that they will see things differently.
Thanks so much.
But he will have to wait on an answer.
This one has been circulated. The court is aware of it, but they have 2 executions scheduled today around the country and another emergency motion coming in from Arizona, and that they're very busy.
And up until he takes his last breath, they can stop it.
And I guess this is just a stat sheet.
Trish Wetterman has no doubt that Johnson murdered her husband.
Mr. Wetterman came out of the store. He stood on this side of the gas pump.
Neither does the cop who worked the case back in '95.
This is where he was shot. Vest at no time with me ever indicated that he was the shooter in that case. He always, from day one, said that Johnson was the shooter.
I think my decision would have been the same. I know it would have been.
For the juror, it is Johnson's own statements that continue to carry the most weight.
I guess there was like 7 or 8, if I'm not mistaken, people that he had told that he himself is the one that pulled out the gun and shot him.
Nevertheless, Johnson's conviction may now be in jeopardy. And so too the widow's plan to close this chapter of her life.
At any point, we could get a call that it's not going to happen. And, you know, the last time it happened, it took 3 years. And, I don't want it to, if that happened, I don't know that I can endure another 3 years of wondering when.
Hi, I'm looking for the guy who used to live across the street here. His name was David Vest.
Waiting and wondering is not an option for Ward Larkin. Taking matters into his own hands, Larkin will go hunting for new evidence in a last-ditch attempt to save Michael Johnson's life. Again.
Are you David Best?
Yes, I am.
I'm a friend of Michael Johnson's. I'm here to try to save his life.
On the day before an execution, a lawyer waits for a phone call. A widow waits for justice. But Ward Larkin waits for no one.
My honest feeling is desperation.
Larkin is a man on a mission. He has traveled 500 miles in search of David Vest, an ex-con who may hold the key to stopping Michael Johnson's execution.
Michael Johnson and friend David Vest were both arrested the next day in a Dallas suburb.
Johnson and Vest are the only people who really know what happened at Jeff Wetterman's murder scene.
Vest is a key witness because he's pleaded guilty to aggravated robbery in this case.
Vest cut a deal with the state and testified that Michael Johnson shot the victim. But he also signed this document, which has led Ward Larkin to believe that the real shooter was David Vest.
This is a sworn confession. He says right in it, I shot Jeffrey Michael Wetterman. You know your way around town?
Now Larkin wants to locate Vest and convince him to come clean.
I'm hoping that he'll change his mind and come forward now and say that the testimony he gave at trial was false.
It's a long shot at best, but with time running out, it's a shot worth taking.
Hi, I'm looking for David Vest.
Yeah, wrong house.
At this location, he discovers that David Vest has moved on, whereabouts unknown.
It's now 6:24.
Larkin has only one day to find Vest and stop the execution of Michael Johnson.
I want it to be over. I don't want to wonder anymore.
For the widow, a stay will only prolong the tragedy that has defined her life for 11 years.
He was given death in this case, so he needs to be put to death. It needs to be finished.
Wetterman's widow, Tricia, and her family held on to each other in court.
Johnson's guilt is definite for Trish. Her certainty due in large part to the same man Ward Larkin is trying to find, David Vest.
When they brought him into the courtroom to, I guess, officially charge him, my father and I were there, and he could not look at us. And to me, you know, I got the impression that he just couldn't bear to be out there with us. And so that was the first time that I thought, maybe he didn't intend for this to happen.
During an 8-year prison stretch for his role in the crime, Vest and Trish began to communicate through a victim offender mediation program. Here, Trish takes the final step in the process, a face-to-face meeting with David Vest.
I couldn't understand why you'd want to see me, but I guess, you need to see me to help yourself, and I needed to do this to help you too, because it was my fault as much as it was my life's fault.
I struggled with, I was raised in church, going to Sunday school. I'm a Christian, and I struggled for a long time with, if, I'm supposed to be a Christian, I should forgive. And I guess maybe that's why I was open to the whole thing to begin with, because he had initiated it.
I let myself get in so much trouble trying to be cool, hanging out with the right people.
Throughout the mediation, David Vest portrays himself as an unwitting accomplice to Michael Johnson's act of murder.
You didn't have any idea he was going to shoot him.
No.
You couldn't have said, look, man, my friend's got a gun and we don't have any money.
I had no idea. At the worst, I thought he might have pulled a gun out. He said, hey, man, come on, right. That was the worst thing going through my mind there. The worst.
Vest appears remorseful, his story convincing. And after 4 hours of conversation, the widow begins to empathize with the convict.
You know, I can remember when I was 15, 16, 17 years old, and my mom and dad telling me the people that you run around with can get you in trouble, you know. I feel like that was the case for him, that he was running with some kids that he shouldn't have been running with at the time. And I forgive him. I really do. Please, please stay out of trouble. Don't make someone else go through the pain that I've had to experience.
But Ward Larkin isn't buying David Vest's story.
I'm looking for David Vest.
Larkin believes Vest lied to save his own neck, and he won't rest until he finds the man and hears the truth.
A friend of mine's in really bad trouble. He's in prison, and David Vest knows what happened.
After knocking on several doors in town, Larkin finally gets a lead on the whereabouts of David Vest and confronts him one-on-one.
All I want you to do is tell the truth. That's all I want.
Truth was he killed that man.
Yeah, but you confessed. You signed a confession.
To what?
That you shot him.
No, I never.
Yes, you did. I have seen the confession. You signed a confession.
Vest says he never knowingly confessed to murder, and he's not about to start now.
Well, dude, Michael Johnson killed that man. I watched him with my own eyes. He did it, and he didn't care about anybody else or nothing. He went back to Dallas, Texas, and he bragged to about 15, 20 people and told all of them that he did it, and he was proud of it.
Okay.
He did it, man. I don't know if you know him personally.
Yeah, sure, I know him personally.
If you knew him before?
No, I didn't know him before.
Oh, you didn't know him before?
No.
He was crazy, wild, and didn't care about nobody or nothing.
I've known him for 8 years.
Yeah, well, I knowed him for a little bit longer, man, and I know he don't care about nobody but himself, man.
Yeah, well, that's not my experience, but...
Well, I don't know what the problem is, dude. If you can believe that man sat in your face and lied to you and tell you he didn't do that, I feel for you, brother.
Okay.
Because you can't read people too good. That man did it.
Okay.
How far did you travel to come try to talk to me?
I live in Houston.
You traveled all the way here from
Yeah, I'm trying to save his life.
I feel for you, brother.
During the conversation, David Vest falls far short of the recantation Larkin had hoped for.
So you're sticking by your testimony?
I'm sticking to the truth.
His attitude and demeanor didn't change at all, and I was, of course, extremely disappointed about his behavior, but, I mean, I can't... I think I did as best as I could without resorting to violence, and I'm not going to resort to violence. Well, thanks for talking to me. But, you know, I will be extremely upset if Michael gets executed.
On the day before the execution, Michael Johnson's friend comes away with nothing. Yet on that same day, Greg White is also at work, drafting one new and final appeal to save Johnson's life.
There is an argument circulating that the protocol for the lethal injection either is cruel and unusual punishment under the 8th Amendment or that it may violate the Texas Constitution, which prohibits torture. The prohibition of torture kind of embodies the idea that there's unnecessary pain.
Arguments similar to this have worked to stay executions in other cases around the country. But will it work for Michael Johnson?
Are they making a speculation about whether the procedure causes pain or not?
Attorney Greg White is up against the ultimate deadline. In less than 24 hours, his client Michael Johnson will be executed.
Because here we sit the day before, the Supreme Court is still considering things.
White is waiting for a phone call from the nation's highest court.
If they decide to hear the case, they will certainly stay the execution.
He has also called upon the governor of Texas for clemency.
Well, they continue to disappoint.
But with the execution fast approaching, it's time for the lawyer to get creative.
I've only barely scratched the surface of doing this, but I have talked to
White is crafting an emergency appeal for state court.
the Court of Criminal Appeals, and he said they're ready to accept it tomorrow morning if I can file it.
He is arguing that the chemicals used in lethal injection cause undue suffering.
There's no need to go through the paralyzation and the potassium chloride. That, in effect, what he says is you can put these people to sleep. The criticism is that when you paralyze people, you can't tell if they're unconscious anymore, and you can't tell if the chemical blow to the heart is a torture or not. Okay, and I'm just going to start writing. And
While White tries to build an argument to save Michael Johnson's life, the inmate's family must now begin to prepare for his death.
So we're here, Polanski unit. We're gonna go in and go through a guard right there in the little green thing.
Michelle and her mother are going to visit Michael on death row. Barring a stay, this private visit will be the last. The Johnson family will say their goodbyes from opposite sides of glass.
Oh no, they won't let me touch him again till he's gone. I haven't touched him in over 10 years. No.
Patricia Johnson gave birth to Michael on May 27, 1977. Now, 29 years later, she struggles with the reality of his impending death.
I don't know. I was proud of him. I loved him. I love him still. And I'm proud of him still. Even after all of this, he's still my son, and I love him. And I'm proud that he was my son, or is my son, because you always are, you know.
My mother, she's always, I'm sorry and all this. I should have been a better mother and all that. She kind of blames herself, but it's like, yeah, I should have done something similar. But you know what I'm saying? I tell her, get off of that and don't worry about it. And I don't know. I don't know what to say to her. It's bothering her more than it is me.
The visit is 4 hours, during which Johnson puts on a stoic face for his mother and sister.
My sister was sitting there just now telling me she's scared to death of dying. I don't understand. She's Christian too. I don't understand that. I mean, I would think being Christian that you'd be ready, you'd be happy to die. So I don't know. It's not an issue anymore. I mean, I don't want to die. I'd rather be laid up somewhere with some pretty little fat gal, but that's not going to happen.
Standing at death's door, Johnson appears indifferent about his fate. The victim's widow, however, is much more apprehensive.
I know that a concern for me is just kind of what we're going to be walking into.
Johnson then screamed obscenities to the jury and Wetterman's family.
To be honest with you, I'm worried about his last words. If he's going to take that opportunity to be ugly to us again.
Despite her fears, Trish will enter the execution chamber to face the man who murdered her husband more than a decade ago.
I feel that I need to see this through, that Michael Johnson's going to know that we haven't forgotten, and that it's still not okay that he did this, that we're still very hurt by it.
Jeff Wetterman's older brother, Bill, also plans to face Michael Johnson and watch him die.
I don't know that I'd say I was looking forward to it. It's not something that I'm uncomfortable about. I have said from the beginning that I needed to be there, that I wanted to be there. It's not going to change anything. It's not going to bring Jeff back. But, I kind of feel like I'll be there in his place. And, Michael Dwayne Johnson witnessed my brother's death, so now I'll witness his.
On Michael Johnson's side, there will be no witness to shed a tear. The convicted killer has decided to go it alone.
The way I see it, man, the reason people have witnesses there is to gain a little comfort for themselves. So they look over, ultimately they're trying to not have to do it by themselves, but you're going to have to do it by yourself. You're the one that's dying. And those are people that care about you. And so they're watching you die. So that's going to traumatize you, especially your mother. And what you're doing is, in order to gain that little bit of comfort for yourself, you're shifting that burden onto them, because they're going to walk away with that and you're going to be gone. So I would just rather keep it myself. I'll just do it myself.
The inmate has also refused a last meal.
Because that, to me, that's like they're mocking you. That's like slapping you in the face saying, you know, we're going to kill you, but we're going to let you get your eat on first. So I was like, you know what? You can keep that last meal. I don't want any of it.
And as for a possible last statement?
I don't know, off or something. I'm kind of pissed about it. And I don't know.
After his final interview, Johnson will return to his cell, unrepentant, unforgiven, and hell-bent on the ultimate act of defiance.
Prison officials say some words were written in blood on Johnson's jail cell wall. We don't yet know what those words are.
11 years have come and gone since the murder of Jeff Wetterman. Now the stage is set for this tragedy's final scene. But Michael Johnson has a different ending in mind.
We have some breaking news for you this hour. A Texas death row inmate who was expected to be executed tonight in Huntsville has been found dead in his jail cell.
At 2:45 a.m., prison guards found Michael Johnson in a pool of blood, dead by his own hand.
Shock. I don't know what to say. I don't know what to think.
At the same time Johnson was ending his life, attorney Greg White was still trying to save it.
Danny, this is Greg White in Waco, Michael Johnson. I mean, the times that I've met with him, that's not what he talked about. He wasn't focused on, you know, I'm going to die or I'm going to go out my own way, or, you know, just nothing said ever that would make you go, I mean, I think this guy is not all right.
State prison officials claim Johnson was on suicide watch and checked every 15 minutes.
News travels quickly throughout Texas, reaching the victim's widow by phone call from a local reporter.
And they said, have you talked to the Department of Criminal Justice? And I said, no. And she said, well, Michael Johnson committed suicide last night in his cell. And I was stunned. And I just said, I gotta go. And I, hung up with her and started calling people.
Detective Mike Nicoletti is the first to arrive at Trish's house.
Ultimately, this is what was expected. Right?
I feel cheated.
You shouldn't, Trish.
If he was going to do this, he should have done it 10 years ago.
Well, it really just shows the type of coward he was. He didn't want to face you again. I think everybody's shocked, I don't know how that could have happened, but I haven't gotten any details other than the fact that it did. As far as the family's concerned, I know they're going to feel like they were cheated, but they need to realize that ultimately this is the outcome they were looking for, and it shows the type of person he was. He was a coward. He didn't want to face that family again. And, so he took his own life.
Prison officials say some words were written in blood on Johnson's jail cell wall. We don't yet know what those words are.
There have been reports, and we have confirmed that, yes, there was a message that he had scrawled in blood on the wall.
By mid-morning, the contents of Johnson's bloody message are the primary subject of media speculation.
Reporters have been saying that he had an indication of innocence, or that he was expressing innocence.
According to several reports, Johnson's last statement, written in his own blood, was, "I didn't do it."
I think it's honorable. I think there's no reason for him to allow somebody to murder him for no good reason.
Michelle Andrews is satisfied with her brother's decision to take his own life.
I think he kept and he maintained his life into his own hands. He fought to the very end. He didn't take the coward's way out. He fought for 11 years. And if they're not going to let an innocent man go, then he wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of murdering him.
Michelle will continue to believe that her brother was an innocent man, wrongfully convicted and condemned to die in Texas.
And he's not the only one. I mean, he's really not the only one. There have been mass numbers of innocent people put to death in this country. And all I can say is they didn't get my brother.
Never did it enter my thoughts that he would do this. It didn't. Nor mine.
Meanwhile, at Trish's house, the friends and family of Jeff Wetterman are left to wrestle with the meaning of Johnson's suicide.
He still didn't get put to death by the state. He did it himself. He went out on his terms. So, I don't know. I have a lot of mixed emotions.
And listen, we're here for as long as you need us.
Raven Kazin is Director of Victim Services for the Texas Department of Criminal Justice. She is here to offer the state's formal apology.
And this is no excuse, but let me just tell you what happened. I was upset for the victims, and I would have preferred that the victims could have heard it from Victim Services instead of hearing it from the press. So TDCJ certainly wants to offer its apology to you.
Kazin provides the family with details of Johnson's suicide, including a description of the prison shank he used to cut his own throat.
From what we can tell so far, the weapon was made out of popsicle sticks with the cutting instrument tied on with some kind of dental floss.
It was probably, though, a lot more painful than what the state was going to do.
Are you asking my opinion?
It would have to be.
I've witnessed numerous executions. I believe our executions are humane. They, from all appearances, appear to be painless. I would think that the way he died was much more violent than had he been executed.
By the close of day, the family's feelings of disappointment give way to a greater sense of relief that after 11 years of waiting and wondering, their tragic story has finally come to an end.
People talk about closure, and I don't know that there's any closure to it. There'll ever be any closure to it, but at least this part of it, the cancer, if you will, has been removed, but the scars are still there. The pain in the void will always be there. It hasn't lessened any over the last 11 years.
It's over, and it feels over. And I said before, when we talked, that I didn't really think there was any such thing as closure. That him being put to death wasn't going to bring Jeff back. And it didn't, but it feels over. I feel like a weight has been lifted off my shoulders. I really do. It's strange. It's almost like almost like I'm at peace.
On the morning of November 20th, 2018, the quiet community of Colts Neck, New Jersey, became the center of a crime so disturbing that investigators would spend years trying to reconstruct exactly what happened. Yet inside one of those expensive homes on Willowbrook Road, a family was about to become the victim of a brutal attack. 4 members of the Caniro family would die that day. Keith Caniro, his wife Jennifer, and their 2 young children, Jesse and Sophia. At first, there was no obvious reason for anyone outside the family to imagine that danger was approaching. Keith Caniro was 50 years old and had built a life around his family and his business interests. Jennifer, 45, was raising their children with him. Jesse was 11 years old, while Sophia was 8. The business world surrounding Keith and his brother Paul had become increasingly complicated. The relationship between Keith and Paul Caniro would eventually become one of the most important elements in the investigation. The two brothers were connected through business, money, and family history. They had worked together in ventures involving technology and contracting, and their financial relationship was not always smooth. According to prosecutors, tensions had developed over money and business dealings before the killings. Those tensions would later provide the foundation for the prosecution's theory of motive. But on the night before the murders, there was nothing that publicly revealed how catastrophic the next day would become. Keith and Jennifer were at home with their children. Their house stood on a large property, separated from the road and surrounded by the kind of space that normally offered security. The family had no reason to expect that their home would soon become a crime scene. Then, in the early hours of November 20th, another house connected to the Caniro family caught fire. That house belonged to Paul Caniro in Ocean Township. The fire immediately appeared serious, and Paul's wife and two daughters were inside the residence. They managed to escape. Firefighters responded and worked to control the blaze, while the circumstances surrounding it remained unclear. The situation changed dramatically when another fire was reported at Keith Caniro's home in Colts Neck. Emergency crews arrived at Keith's property and found the residence burning. Flames had already caused extensive damage, and firefighters concentrated on controlling the fire and searching the structure. What they discovered transformed the investigation, for people were dead. Keith Caniro was found outside the home. Jennifer and the two children were found inside. The initial appearance of a devastating house fire quickly gave way to something far more horrifying. Investigators found evidence that the victims had suffered violent deaths before the fire, indicating that the blaze was not the cause of what had happened to them. Instead, it appeared to have been deliberately set after the killings. The discovery immediately raised a crucial question. Who would want an entire family dead? Keith had been shot. His wife and children had also been attacked. The violence was not consistent with a simple robbery or a random household burglary. There was no obvious explanation that could account for the deaths of 4 members of the same family and the deliberate destruction of their home. Investigators began examining the family's relationships, finances, business dealings, and recent conflicts. As detectives worked through the scene, another disturbing question emerged. Why had Paul's house also burned earlier that same morning? The two fires suddenly looked less like separate accidents and more like pieces of the same story. The case would eventually become one of the most closely watched homicide investigations in New Jersey, but in those first hours, investigators had to work without knowing where the evidence would lead. The victims could no longer explain what had happened. The house had been severely damaged by fire. Important physical evidence might have been destroyed, and the person responsible, if the fires were connected, could already be far away. Yet there was one fact that investigators could not overlook. Paul Caniro was Keith's brother. Investigators still needed to establish a motive, determine how the killings occurred, identify the person responsible, and understand the purpose of the fires. Every detail had to be examined carefully because the case involved not only a multiple homicide, but also a possible attempt to disguise the crime. The investigators' attention increasingly turned toward the timeline. The sequence of events mattered. Paul's house had burned. His family had escaped. Keith's house had then burned, leaving 4 people dead. If the same person was responsible for both fires, the timing could reveal whether they were part of a coordinated plan. The possibility that security cameras had been disabled added another layer to the investigation. A person familiar with the home might have known where the cameras were and understood how to reduce the chance of being recorded. This was no longer being treated as a mysterious fire. It was becoming a homicide investigation involving a family member. As detectives reconstructed the morning, they also began looking at Keith's recent business relationships. Prosecutors would later argue that money was at the heart of the case. They alleged that Paul had financial disputes with Keith, and that those disputes had become serious enough to create a motive for murder. The prosecution's eventual theory was that Paul wanted to eliminate Keith because of financial pressure and business conflicts, then destroy evidence and create confusion by setting fires at both properties. But none of that could be accepted simply because it sounded plausible. Investigators needed evidence capable of surviving scrutiny in court. For the Caniro family, however, the legal questions would come much later. In the immediate aftermath, there was only devastation. Jennifer was gone. Jesse and Sophia were gone. Keith was gone. One family had been destroyed inside the place where they should have been safest. Neighbors watched emergency vehicles move around the property, while investigators began the painstaking process of documenting the scene. Fire investigators examined the remains of the house. Detectives searched for evidence that could explain the sequence of violence. Medical examiners worked to determine the causes and circumstances of each death. The investigation would ultimately force detectives to examine not only the physical evidence left behind, but also the private tensions that had developed between two brothers. Those tensions, hidden beneath ordinary family connections, would become increasingly important as the case unfolded and changed everything. The investigation would soon reach beyond Colts Neck. It would involve Ocean Township, business records, financial transactions, surveillance evidence, forensic findings, and years of courtroom arguments. Paul Canairo would deny responsibility for the killings, and the defense would challenge the prosecution's interpretation of the evidence. But on November 20th, none of that was known. What was known was brutally simple. For people from one family had been killed, and two homes connected to the family had burned within the same period. One of those homes belonged to the brother of a murdered man. That coincidence would become the starting point of a case that refused to disappear. The Canairo murders were not simply a story about violence in an affluent New Jersey community. They became a story about how financial disputes can collide with family relationships, how an apparently ordinary home can become the center of a major criminal investigation, and how investigators attempt to reconstruct a crime after fire has destroyed much of the physical scene. For the people who knew Keith, Jennifer, Jesse, and Sophia, the questions were deeply personal. Who had done this? Why had the children been killed? Why had their home been burned? And why had another Canairo residence caught fire only hours earlier? Those questions would drive the investigation for years. The answers would eventually lead prosecutors to a chilling theory, one that would shape the entire case: that the killings were not spontaneous, but the result of a calculated decision rooted in money and family conflict. Yet before that theory could be tested in court, investigators first had to establish the basic truth of what happened inside and outside the Colts Neck home. The first step was to understand the final hours of the family. And that meant going back to the beginning of the night before the fires, before the emergency calls, before the investigators arrived, and before a quiet New Jersey neighborhood realized that 4 lives had been taken. The story of the Canairo family massacre, therefore, begins not with the courtroom, but with an ordinary family home, a complicated brotherly relationship, and a series of events that unfolded with terrifying speed on a November morning. What appeared at first to be 2 devastating fires would become something much darker, setting investigators on a path toward one of the most disturbing family homicide cases in New Jersey history. The hours leading up to the Canairo family massacre were filled with ordinary routines, but investigators would later examine those hours with extraordinary attention. Every movement, every telephone call, every vehicle, and every unexplained decision could potentially reveal how the 4 deaths had been planned. The tragedy in Colts Neck did not appear to begin when firefighters arrived. According to the prosecution's later reconstruction, the events began much earlier, involving 2 brothers whose financial relationship had deteriorated behind the scenes. Keith Canairo had built a life around his family and several business interests. His brother Paul was also involved in those ventures, creating a complicated mixture of family loyalty and financial dependence. To outsiders, disagreements between relatives could appear ordinary. Business partners argue, siblings disagree about money, and families sometimes survive serious conflicts. But investigators would later hear allegations that the disagreements between Keith and Paul had become much more consequential. Keith's wife, Jennifer, was not part of the business dispute in the way the brothers were. Their children, Jesse and Sophia, were even further removed from it. They were simply children living with their parents. Their presence in the house would make the eventual crime especially difficult for investigators and devastating for everyone who knew the family. As November 19th became November 20th, the Canairo family home in Colts Neck remained quiet. The property was large, private, and separated from the busiest parts of the community. Nothing about the residence suggested that it was about to become the scene of a multiple homicide. Yet somewhere during the final hours of the night, the circumstances surrounding the family changed permanently. The first major alarm came from Paul's home in Ocean Township. A fire broke out there during the early morning hours. The presence of Paul's wife and daughters inside the house made the incident potentially fatal, but they escaped. Firefighters responded and treated the blaze as an emergency requiring immediate action. At that stage, there was no publicly established connection between the fire and Keith's household. The timing, however, would soon become impossible to ignore. Not long afterward, emergency personnel were called to Keith's home in Colts Neck. This second fire was dramatically different. The building was burning, and inside were the bodies of Keith, Jennifer, Jesse, and Sophia. Keith had been shot, while the other 3 victims had suffered fatal attacks involving gunfire and stabbing. The fire had not simply destroyed property. It had followed a violent crime. Investigators now had 2 locations, 2 fires, and 2 brothers connected to both locations. That realization changed the direction of the investigation. Detectives began treating the fires as potential components of a single sequence. They needed to establish which event happened first, who had access to each property, and whether the fires were intended to destroy evidence. They also needed to determine whether the attacker had deliberately disabled security equipment at Keith's home. The prosecution would eventually argue that Paul had disabled security cameras before approaching Keith's residence. According to that theory, the action demonstrated knowledge of the property and an effort to prevent investigators from obtaining a complete record of the attack. The defense disputed aspects of the prosecution's interpretation, and years of legal arguments would follow over the admissibility and significance of surveillance evidence. In the immediate aftermath, investigators did not have the luxury of knowing which pieces of evidence would eventually survive in court. They had to preserve everything. The medical evidence became essential. Keith's death could not be explained by the fire because he had sustained gunshot wounds. Jennifer and the children had also suffered injuries indicating that they were victims of homicide. Determining the nature and sequence of those injuries would help investigators understand what happened before the flames spread through the house. The question of sequence was particularly important. Did the attacker kill everyone first and then start the fire? Were the victims attacked at different times? Was the fire intended to conceal the bodies, destroy evidence, or create the appearance of another kind of crime? Every answer narrowed the possibilities. Meanwhile, investigators had to understand Paul's movements. His own residence had burned, his family had survived, and his brother's family had been killed. If the 2 fires were connected, Paul's whereabouts during the critical period could become central to the case. The investigators examined physical evidence, surveillance material, financial records, communications, and statements from people who knew the brothers. They were looking for contradictions. A person's account of events might appear harmless until compared with a camera record or a telephone record. A financial transaction might appear insignificant until viewed alongside a business dispute. The prosecution's theory gradually developed around money. According to prosecutors, Keith and Paul had experienced serious financial conflict through their business dealings. The state alleged that Keith had become aware of financial irregularities and that the relationship between the brothers had deteriorated. Prosecutors later argued that Paul had a financial motive to eliminate Keith, and that the murder of the entire household was part of a broader effort to conceal the crime. The alleged motive was not presented as a single argument that suddenly exploded into violence. Instead, prosecutors portrayed it as the culmination of mounting resentment, financial pressure, and calculation. That distinction mattered. Investigators began asking whether the Cairo case showed the second pattern. Another troubling detail was the fire at Paul's own home. If Paul had been responsible for the deaths in Colts Neck, why would he risk setting fire to his own residence while his wife and children were there? The prosecution would eventually argue that the fire served a larger purpose. By damaging his own house, Paul could potentially make it appear that an unknown attacker had targeted multiple members of the Cairo family. The fire could also destroy evidence connected to the earlier events. For the defense, this interpretation raised obvious questions. A theory involving a deliberate fire at one's own occupied home had to explain why such an action would be worth the enormous risk. The presence of Paul's family made the allegation particularly serious. The investigation therefore moved in two directions at once. Detectives were reconstructing the murders at Keith's property while also trying to determine exactly how the Ocean Township fire had started. The connection between the two scenes became stronger as evidence accumulated. What initially looked like a tragic sequence of fires increasingly resembled a coordinated series of actions. Yet investigators still needed proof linking Paul directly to the killings. Suspicion alone would not be enough. As the days passed, the case became increasingly focused on the brothers' financial relationship. Investigators examined businesses associated with Keith and Paul and traced transactions that might reveal the source of their conflict. They looked for evidence of debts, disputed payments, ownership interests, and financial pressure. This was a horrifying theory, but investigators were required to test it against the evidence rather than simply assume it was true. Meanwhile, the Canaro family was struggling with the aftermath. A husband, wife, brother, and 2 children had disappeared from the lives of their relatives in a matter of hours. Friends and neighbors were left trying to understand how violence could have entered such a seemingly ordinary household. For investigators, sympathy could not replace procedure. The property had to be processed. Bodies had to be examined. Evidence had to be cataloged. Statements had to be recorded. Timelines had to be constructed. And Paul Canaro was no longer simply a grieving brother whose house had also burned. He had become a central figure in the investigation. The authorities would soon confront him with questions about his movements, his relationship with Keith, the fires, and the events surrounding the deaths. What he said, what he did not say, and what independent evidence could confirm would shape the next stage of the case. The first hours had produced a terrifying mystery. The next phase would begin transforming that mystery into a prosecution. But before investigators could establish what happened inside the Colts Neck house, they needed to reconstruct the final moments of 4 people who had no opportunity to tell their own story. Their deaths, the damaged surveillance system, the 2 fires, and the brothers' financial conflict would eventually form the framework of the case against Paul Canaro. And the closer investigators looked at the timeline, the harder it became to regard the fires as accidents. The investigation into the Canaro family killings entered a new and more complicated phase once detectives began comparing the evidence from Colts Neck with what had happened at Paul Canaro's home in Ocean Township. The 2 fires had transformed what might otherwise have been a straightforward homicide investigation into a much larger puzzle. Investigators were no longer asking only who had killed Keith, Jennifer, Jesse, and Sophia. They were asking why 2 houses connected to the same family had burned within hours of one another, whether the fires had been deliberately connected, and what the person responsible had hoped to accomplish. The answer would depend heavily on the timeline. Keith Canaro had been found outside his home with fatal gunshot wounds. His wife Jennifer and their children, Jesse and Sophia, were found inside. The condition of the residence made it difficult to reconstruct every detail, because the fire had damaged the physical scene. Nevertheless, investigators were able to determine that the victims had suffered violent attacks before the fire consumed much of the property. That distinction was critical. If the fire had caused the deaths, investigators would have been dealing primarily with a suspicious fatal blaze. Instead, they were investigating 4 murders followed by an apparent attempt to destroy the scene. The condition of the victims also helped investigators establish that different forms of violence had been used. Keith had been shot, while Jennifer and the children had suffered injuries consistent with both shooting and stabbing. The brutality of the attack suggested that whoever entered the home had been prepared to use extreme violence. The presence of the children made the case particularly disturbing. Jesse was only 11 years old. Sophia was 8. There was no suggestion that either child had any connection to the business disputes investigators were examining. Whatever conflict existed between the adults, the children were innocent members of the household who happened to be present when the attack occurred. Investigators therefore had to consider whether the killings were intended to eliminate witnesses, whether the victims had been deliberately targeted as a family, or whether the violence had escalated after the attacker entered the home. At the same time, attention turned toward the security system. Surveillance cameras can be among the most valuable sources of evidence in a homicide investigation. They can establish who approached a property, when a person arrived, where vehicles traveled, and how long someone remained at a scene. In this case, However, prosecutors would later argue that the security system at Keith's home had been deliberately disabled. That allegation became one of the most significant pieces of the prosecution's theory. If someone had intentionally interfered with the cameras before the attack, it could indicate preparation rather than spontaneous violence. It could also suggest that the attacker knew the property and understood how its security equipment worked. The prosecution would eventually maintain that Paul was responsible for disabling the system. The defense challenged the state's interpretation of the evidence and argued against conclusions that went beyond what the physical record could establish. Years later, the question of the surveillance evidence would become the subject of a major legal battle. But during the early investigation, detectives were primarily interested in what the equipment could reveal. The Ocean Township fire provided another important piece of the puzzle. Paul's wife and daughters had been inside the house when it caught fire. They escaped, leaving investigators to determine whether the blaze had been accidental or deliberately started. If the fire was intentional, the next question was why someone would target Paul's home. At first, the two fires could have been treated as separate incidents. One involved Paul's residence, while the other involved Keith's. But once investigators learned that Keith and Paul were brothers, the relationship became impossible to ignore. The circumstances became even more significant because of the short periods separating the incidents. Investigators began reconstructing Paul's movements during the critical hours. They looked at available surveillance recordings, vehicle movements, communications, physical evidence, and statements. Each source had to be compared against the others. A timeline is often one of the strongest tools in a complex criminal investigation because it limits what could have happened. If a suspect claimed to be in one location at a certain time, investigators could compare that statement with cameras, telephone records, witnesses, and other evidence. If the pieces did not match, the contradiction could become important. The financial relationship between the brothers provided another direction. Keith and Paul had been involved in business together, and prosecutors later portrayed their relationship as increasingly strained. According to the state's theory, financial disagreements had created resentment and pressure. Prosecutors argued that Keith had discovered problems involving money and that Paul had a strong financial reason to silence him. The alleged motive became more specific as the investigation progressed. Prosecutors eventually argued that Paul stood to benefit financially from Keith's death, including through a life insurance policy. But a financial motive by itself could not prove murder. Investigators needed to connect motive with opportunity and action. They needed evidence showing that Paul had the means to carry out the killings and that his behavior before and after the crime was consistent with the prosecution's theory. The alleged sequence began to take shape. Prosecutors would later contend that Paul went to Keith's property, interfered with the security system, confronted Keith, and shot him. They further alleged that Jennifer and the children were killed inside the house before the building was deliberately set on fire. Paul then allegedly returned to his own residence, where the second fire was started. If true, the sequence suggested a carefully constructed plan, but investigators understood that the theory had to withstand questions from a jury. Why would Paul risk exposing himself by creating another fire? Why would he involve his own home? Why were Paul's wife and daughters placed in danger? Those questions became part of the larger mystery. The prosecution's eventual explanation was that the fire at Paul's residence could help create the appearance that the Caniro family was being attacked by an unknown enemy. If investigators believed that someone was targeting the entire family, suspicion might initially move away from Paul. The strategy, if that was indeed the purpose, carried enormous risk. The fire could also potentially destroy physical evidence. Flames, smoke, water, and firefighting operations can dramatically alter a crime scene. Objects can be damaged or destroyed, while traces that might otherwise identify an offender can become difficult to recover. Yet investigators recovered enough evidence to continue building the case. The financial investigation became increasingly important. Detectives examined the businesses connected to the brothers and sought to understand how money moved between them. They looked at records that could reveal whether Keith and Paul had experienced disagreements over payments or ownership. The investigation was not limited to what happened on the morning of November 20th. Detectives had to understand the months and years preceding the murders. A motive does not usually emerge from a single moment. It can develop through accumulated disagreements, financial pressure, resentment, and personal conflict. For the prosecution, this history helped explain why Paul might have wanted Keith dead. For the defense, the same history could be interpreted differently. Business disagreements do not automatically lead to murder, and family conflict alone cannot establish criminal responsibility. This distinction would remain central throughout the case. As investigators gathered evidence, Paul became the primary suspect. His connection to Keith was obvious. His house had also burned, and the alleged financial motive provided a possible explanation. But suspicion was only the beginning. On November 21st, one day after the killings, Paul was arrested in connection with the investigation. The authorities had moved quickly, but the case itself was far from over. The charges would grow more serious as investigators continued examining the evidence. Paul would ultimately face accusations involving the deaths of all 4 members of Keith's family, as well as offenses connected to the fires and other alleged conduct. Paul denied killing his brother and the other victims. That denial meant the case would eventually have to be decided in court. For the next several years, evidence would be challenged, witnesses would be questioned, forensic findings would be reviewed, and prosecutors and defense attorneys would argue over what investigators had discovered. Some evidence would become the subject of constitutional disputes, particularly material obtained from the surveillance system at Paul's home. The case would also be delayed for years, meaning that the final judgment would not come quickly. The families of the victims would have to wait while the legal system determined which evidence could be presented and whether prosecutors could prove their allegations beyond a reasonable doubt. But in the early days after the massacre, investigators did not know that the case would last for years. They were still standing at the beginning of an investigation that had already produced 4 victims, 2 fires, and a suspect connected to every major part of the story. The central question was no longer whether the deaths were accidental. They clearly were not. The question was whether the person investigators suspected had deliberately created the entire sequence. As detectives followed the evidence, the private world of the Caniro brothers began to emerge. Business dealings that once seemed like ordinary family matters were being examined for clues. Financial records were being scrutinized. Surveillance evidence was becoming increasingly important. The 2 fires were being analyzed as possible parts of a single plan. And behind every piece of evidence stood the same 4 names: Keith, Jennifer, Jesse, and Sophia. Their deaths had transformed a quiet neighborhood into a crime scene and turned a family dispute into a homicide investigation of national attention. The investigators now had to prove what had happened before the flames, establish who had entered Keith's home, determine how the security system had been disabled, and uncover whether the financial conflict between 2 brothers could truly explain the destruction of an entire family. The next stage of the investigation would bring even greater attention to Paul's movements, the evidence recovered from the 2 properties, and the financial records that prosecutors believed could reveal the motive behind the killings. The arrest of Paul Caniro did not bring an immediate end to the investigation. In many ways, it marked the beginning of a much longer and more difficult process. Detectives had identified the man they believed was responsible, but prosecutors still had to transform a complicated collection of fires, financial disputes, surveillance evidence, forensic findings, and witness statements into a case that could withstand years of legal challenges. For the families of Keith and Jennifer Caniro, the arrest also brought a painful mixture of relief and uncertainty. For members of their family were dead, yet the full circumstances remained disputed. Paul maintained his innocence regarding the killings, while prosecutors increasingly presented him as the person at the center of a carefully organized plan. The investigation continued to focus on the relationship between the 2 brothers. Keith and Paul had known each other their entire lives, but their connection had become more than a family relationship. They were also connected through business interests, which meant that disagreements over money could affect both their personal and professional lives. Prosecutors would eventually argue that this combination of family and financial conflict created a dangerous situation. According to their theory, Paul had developed a powerful financial motive to eliminate Keith. The state claimed that Keith had discovered irregularities involving money and that the brothers were experiencing increasing tension over their business arrangements. The defense viewed the situation differently. Financial disagreements could explain arguments between brothers, but they did not automatically prove that one brother would commit 4 murders. The defense would later argue that investigators had concentrated too heavily on Paul while interpreting ambiguous evidence in the way most favorable to the prosecution. That disagreement over interpretation became one of the defining features of the case. Meanwhile, investigators continued examining the 2 fire scenes. The Colts Neck property had sustained extensive damage, but investigators still searched for evidence that could establish how the attack unfolded. Fire scenes are notoriously difficult to interpret because the flames can destroy materials, alter the appearance of rooms, and contaminate areas with water and firefighting chemicals. Nevertheless, forensic specialists were able to determine that the deaths had occurred through violence rather than simply from the fire. The evidence concerning Keith was particularly important. He had been shot outside the residence. This suggested that the attacker had not simply entered the house and started shooting indiscriminately. There was a sequence of actions that investigators needed to reconstruct. Jennifer and the children were inside. Their deaths raised another set of questions. If the motive was primarily a business dispute between Keith and Paul, why had Jennifer and the children also been killed? Prosecutors would later argue that the additional killings could eliminate witnesses and ensure that no member of the household could provide investigators with an account of the attack. The prosecution portrayed the violence against the family as part of a deliberate effort to leave no witnesses behind. The defense rejected that interpretation. The distinction between evidence and inference was crucial. Investigators could establish that 4 people had been killed. They could examine injuries, locations, and physical evidence. But determining the exact intention behind each action required a broader reconstruction of the crime. The surveillance system became increasingly important. According to prosecutors, security cameras at Keith's property had been disabled before the killings. The state argued that this was evidence of preparation because someone had taken steps to prevent the cameras from recording the attack. If Paul had done this, prosecutors maintained, it would suggest that he knew the property and had anticipated the need to avoid surveillance. The defense challenged the government's use of surveillance evidence and questioned whether investigators had obtained and interpreted it properly. The legal battle over that evidence would eventually reach the New Jersey Supreme Court. The dispute was not merely technical. If the recordings were admitted, prosecutors could use them as part of their reconstruction of the events surrounding the fires. If they were excluded, the state's ability to establish the timeline could be weakened. The issue became even more complicated because investigators had entered Paul's property during an emergency involving the fire. Police and firefighters were responding to an active blaze, and evidence was collected during that process. Years later, lawyers would argue over whether investigators had exceeded constitutional limits when they obtained certain material from the property. The New Jersey Supreme Court ultimately ruled in favor of allowing the contested evidence to be used, finding that the circumstances surrounding the fire provided sufficient justification for the police actions. That decision would become important when the case finally reached trial. While the legal arguments continued, prosecutors kept developing their financial theory. They examined business records and transactions involving the brothers, looking for evidence that could demonstrate pressure on Paul and potential financial benefit from Keith's death. One particularly significant allegation concerned a life insurance policy. Prosecutors argued that Paul could benefit from approximately $1.5 million connected to Keith's death. The alleged financial benefit gave the prosecution another way to explain why Paul might have been willing to take the enormous risk of killing his own brother. But once again, the defense could argue that financial benefit does not prove that a person committed murder. A person can be listed as a beneficiary without ever intending to harm the insured. The jury would eventually have to consider the insurance evidence together with everything else. The prosecution also examined Paul's behavior after the killings. Investigators were interested in whether his actions were consistent with those of someone attempting to conceal a crime. The fire at his own home was particularly significant because it had occurred while his family was inside. His wife and daughters survived, but the circumstances surrounding the blaze remained troubling. Prosecutors argued that the second fire was not an isolated event. Instead, they portrayed it as part of a strategy designed to make investigators believe that an unknown person was attacking the Caniro family. This alleged deception became one of the most disturbing aspects of the state's theory. Imagine the investigators' perspective during those first hours. One Cairo home had burned, and then another Cairo home had burned. One family had survived the first fire, while another family had been murdered in the second. The situation could initially suggest that someone was deliberately targeting the family. If the fires were connected, investigators had to determine who could have moved between the two locations. That was where Paul's connection became so important. He was not an outsider who had to somehow discover the family's routines. He was Keith's brother. He had business connections with Keith. He knew the family. He had a residence that had also burned. And according to prosecutors, financial conflict gave him a motive. Each fact might have had an innocent explanation on its own. Together, prosecutors believed they formed a compelling pattern. The defense, however, insisted that a pattern was not the same as proof. This tension would remain unresolved for years. The case also attracted enormous public attention because of the victims' ages. Jesse was only 11, and Sophia was 8. Their deaths made the crime especially difficult for the community to understand. There was no obvious reason why children should have become targets in a dispute involving adults and business finances. The prosecution's theory offered one explanation. The children were killed because they were present and could have become witnesses. But that explanation could not lessen the horror for the surviving relatives. The Cairo family was now divided by tragedy and suspicion. Paul was accused of destroying the family of his own brother, while other relatives had to cope with the loss of 4 people and the public scrutiny surrounding the investigation. As the months became years, the case gradually moved from the crime scene into the courtroom. Paul faced multiple charges, including 4 counts of murder and offenses related to arson and weapons. The prosecution sought to prove that the killings were deliberate and that the fires were part of a broader attempt to cover them up. The defense prepared to challenge the state's evidence. There would be no quick resolution. Court proceedings were delayed by legal disputes, evidentiary questions, and eventually the enormous disruption caused by the COVID-19 pandemic. The longer the case continued, the more important every piece of evidence became. The families waited. Investigators continued reviewing their work. Lawyers continued arguing over evidence. And Paul remained at the center of the case. The most important question remained whether the state could prove that he had personally carried out the murders rather than merely establish that he had a complicated relationship with the victims and had been connected to the fires. That distinction would determine everything. The prosecution's case was gradually becoming a narrative of preparation, execution, and concealment. According to that narrative, Paul had a financial motive, knew Keith's property, interfered with its security system, killed Keith, killed Jennifer and the children, set the Colts Neck home on fire, and then returned to Ocean Township, where he allegedly set fire to his own house to create confusion. The defense would challenge nearly every element of that narrative. Could the surveillance evidence reliably place Paul where prosecutors claimed he was? Could the financial records establish a genuine motive for murder? Could the fire evidence prove intentional destruction rather than another explanation? Could the state establish the sequence of events beyond a reasonable doubt? Those questions would eventually be presented to a jury. But before that could happen, the case would pass through another critical stage. Prosecutors would need to preserve their evidence while defense attorneys continued challenging its admissibility. The surveillance recordings, financial records, forensic evidence, and circumstances surrounding the 2 fires would all become potential battlegrounds. For the surviving relatives, the waiting must have seemed endless. The massacre had occurred in November 2018. Years later, there was still no verdict. Yet the investigation had already transformed the public understanding of the case. What began as 2 mysterious fires had become an alleged story of financial conflict, family betrayal, murder, and attempted concealment. The next major chapter would focus on the courtroom battles that determined which pieces of that story a jury would actually be allowed to hear. Those decisions would ultimately shape the trial that could determine Paul Cairo's fate. Years after the Cairo family massacre, the case remained far from finished. The 4 deaths in Colts Neck had produced a suspect, an arrest, and a growing body of evidence. But the path toward trial was complicated by legal battles over what prosecutors would be allowed to present to a jury. The central question was no longer simply what investigators believed had happened. It was whether the evidence supporting that theory had been obtained legally and whether it was strong enough to prove 4 murders beyond a reasonable doubt. For Paul Canairo, those questions were critical. He continued to deny responsibility for the killings. His defense challenged the prosecution's reconstruction of events and disputed the significance of several pieces of evidence. Prosecutors, meanwhile, continued to maintain that the murders were the culmination of financial conflict between 2 brothers and that the fires had been deliberately created as part of an attempt to conceal the crime. One of the most important battles involved surveillance evidence connected to Paul's home. Investigators had obtained material from a security system after the fire at the Ocean Township residence. The state believed the recordings and related information could help establish Paul's movements and clarify what happened around the time of the 2 fires. The defense argued that investigators had obtained the evidence in violation of constitutional protections. The circumstances were complicated because the police had been responding to an active fire. When emergency personnel enter a burning home, their immediate responsibility is to protect lives and secure the scene. But once the emergency has passed, the rules governing searches and seizures become more complicated. The dispute eventually moved through the New Jersey court system. For the prosecution, the surveillance material could help connect the events at Paul's house with the murders at Keith's home. For the defense, excluding that evidence could significantly weaken the state's ability to reconstruct the timeline. The legal dispute, therefore, became much more than a technical argument. It had the potential to determine what the eventual jury would see. The New Jersey Supreme Court ultimately ruled that the evidence could be used. The court concluded that the circumstances surrounding the fire provided sufficient justification for the actions taken by investigators. The decision cleared an important obstacle for prosecutors and allowed evidence from the surveillance system to remain part of the case. That ruling did not prove that Paul had committed the murders. It simply meant that prosecutors could present the evidence and argue its significance before a jury. The case still required a complete narrative. Prosecutors had to explain what happened to Keith first. They alleged that Paul had gone to the Colts Neck property and interfered with the security system. Keith was then shot outside the house. The prosecution maintained that the attack continued inside, where Jennifer and the children were killed. The alleged sequence was disturbing because it suggested that the attacker had not simply confronted Keith and fled. Instead, prosecutors portrayed the entire household as being deliberately eliminated. Afterward, according to the state, the house was set on fire. The fire served several possible purposes in the prosecution's theory. It could destroy physical evidence, obscure the circumstances of the murders, and make it more difficult for investigators to reconstruct the scene. It could also make the deaths appear initially connected to a devastating household fire rather than a carefully planned homicide. The second fire at Paul's home then became another part of the alleged plan. Prosecutors argued that setting fire to Paul's residence could create the impression that an unknown person had targeted members of the Canairo family. His wife and daughters were inside the home when the fire began, and they escaped. To the prosecution, that fact did not disprove the theory. Instead, prosecutors argued that the danger to his own family demonstrated how far the alleged plan had gone. The defense could point to that same fact from another perspective. If Paul truly intended to conceal 4 murders, why would he create another dangerous fire while his own family was inside? The defense could argue that the circumstances were too reckless and complicated to fit neatly into the prosecution's theory. The jury would eventually have to decide which interpretation was supported by the evidence. The financial evidence formed another major part of the state's case. Keith and Paul had been connected through business dealings, and prosecutors claimed their relationship had deteriorated because of money. According to the state, Keith had become aware of financial irregularities and the brothers were experiencing increasing tension. Prosecutors presented the conflict as a possible motive for murder. They also pointed to a life insurance policy that could provide a substantial financial benefit following Keith's death. The amount discussed by prosecutors was approximately $1.5 million. That evidence gave the state a clear explanation for why Paul might have wanted Keith dead. But the defense could argue that the existence of an insurance benefit was circumstantial. Being connected to a policy does not automatically establish a plan to murder the insured person. The prosecution therefore needed more than motive. It needed opportunity. It needed physical evidence. It needed a credible timeline. and it needed to show that Paul's behavior before and after the killings was consistent with the state's reconstruction. The years of investigation produced evidence that prosecutors believe could satisfy those requirements. Fire investigators examined the two properties. Medical examiners documented the victims' injuries. Detectives reviewed surveillance material and financial records. Investigators also examined communications and other information that could place people at specific locations during the critical hours. Every piece had to fit. The importance of timing became especially clear when prosecutors tried to connect the two fires. The Ocean Township fire occurred before the discovery of the devastation in Colts Neck. If Paul had been responsible for both, his movements between the two locations became crucial. The distance between the homes was not so great that movement between them was impossible. The question was whether independent evidence could establish that Paul had actually made the movements prosecutors alleged. The state believed it could. The defense disagreed. As the case approached trial, both sides prepared to tell fundamentally different stories. The prosecution's story was one of betrayal and calculation. In that version, a financial conflict between brothers developed into an extreme decision. Paul allegedly decided that killing Keith would solve a financial problem. But because Keith had a wife and children, the prosecution argued, Paul ultimately killed all 4 members of the household. He then allegedly burned the home to destroy evidence before returning to his own residence and creating another fire. The defense's story was much more skeptical. It challenged the assumption that every suspicious circumstance pointed toward Paul. It questioned the interpretation of evidence and argued that the state had constructed a narrative from circumstances that did not necessarily prove guilt. The difference between those two stories would eventually be decided by 12 jurors. But the victims remained at the heart of the case. Keith had been a husband, father, brother, and businessman. Jennifer had been a mother and wife. Jesse and Sophia were children whose lives ended before they had the opportunity to grow into adulthood. Their deaths had consequences far beyond the courtroom. Relatives were forced to live with an unimaginable loss while watching the case unfold publicly. Every new hearing, legal decision, and procedural delay reopened memories of the morning when the family disappeared. The long delay was particularly painful. The murders occurred in 2018, but the case did not reach its final trial for years. The COVID-19 pandemic disrupted courts across the country and contributed to delays. Legal arguments over evidence added further complications. During those years, the prosecution continued preparing its case. The defense continued preparing its response. Paul remained charged with multiple serious offenses. The public interest surrounding the case did not disappear. Instead, the passage of time made the eventual trial even more important. Prosecutors would need to explain why they believed the evidence still established Paul's guilt after years of investigation and legal review. Defense attorneys would need to persuade jurors that reasonable doubt remained. By the time the case finally moved toward trial, the story was no longer based solely on what had been discovered at the 2 fire scenes. It had become a complex collection of evidence accumulated over years. The surveillance system was important. The financial records were important. The fire investigations were important. The forensic evidence was important. And Paul's relationship with Keith was important. No single element necessarily told the entire story. Prosecutors needed to persuade jurors that all of those pieces belonged together. The defense, meanwhile, had the opportunity to separate those pieces and challenge the assumptions connecting them. This is one of the defining characteristics of a circumstantial murder case. A jury may never see the crime itself. Instead, jurors must determine whether the surrounding evidence forms a pattern so strong that there is no reasonable alternative explanation. The Cairo case was moving toward precisely that question. Could the state prove that Paul had not merely benefited from circumstances surrounding Keith's death, but had deliberately planned and carried out the murders of 4 people? Could it prove that the fires were intentional acts designed to conceal what had happened? Could it prove that the financial conflict provided the motive? And could it prove every essential element beyond a reasonable doubt? The answers would eventually emerge inside a courtroom. But before the jury could hear the prosecution's case, the evidence had to survive one final stage, trial. The years of investigation had produced an enormous record, But now that record would be reduced to testimony, exhibits, forensic findings, and arguments presented before jurors. For the first time, the public would hear the prosecution explain in detail how it believed the 4 members of the Canairo family had been killed. The defense would have its own opportunity to challenge that explanation, and Paul Canairo would finally face the people who would determine whether the evidence was enough to convict him. The long wait was nearly over. The next chapter would move inside the courtroom, where prosecutors would begin presenting the evidence they believed connected Paul to the deaths of his brother, sister-in-law, and 2 young nieces. When the Canairo case finally moved toward trial, the prosecution had to transform years of investigation into a story that a jury could understand. The evidence was complicated, the events had occurred years earlier, and much of the physical scene had been damaged by fire. Yet the state's case depended on convincing jurors that the apparent chaos of November 20th, 2018, actually followed a deliberate sequence. At the center of that sequence was Paul Canairo. Prosecutors maintained that the killings were not the result of an unexpected argument or sudden loss of control. They described a calculated plan motivated primarily by financial conflict between Paul and his brother Keith. According to the state, the relationship between the 2 men had deteriorated over business dealings and money, creating resentment that eventually became deadly. The defense rejected that characterization. Paul had consistently denied committing the murders, and his attorneys challenged the state's interpretation of the evidence. Their task was to persuade jurors that the prosecution's theory contained gaps and that suspicion, even when supported by troubling circumstances, was not enough to establish guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. The courtroom therefore became the place where 2 competing versions of the same tragedy would collide. The prosecution began with the victims. Keith Canairo was 50 years old. Jennifer was 45. Their children, Jesse and Sophia, were only 11 and 8. They had been together inside their Colts Neck home when the violence occurred. Keith was later found outside the residence, while Jennifer and the children were found inside. The state emphasized the ages of the children because their deaths demonstrated the scale of the alleged crime. Whatever dispute had existed between the brothers, Jesse and Sophia had nothing to do with the business conflict. Prosecutors argued that their presence inside the home made them potential witnesses and that their deaths were therefore part of the effort to eliminate anyone who could later identify the attacker. The defense could challenge that inference, but the underlying fact could not be disputed. For members of one family were dead. The forensic evidence helped establish how they died. Keith had suffered fatal gunshot wounds. Jennifer and the children had also suffered violent injuries, including wounds associated with shooting and stabbing. These findings were significant because they established that the fire was not responsible for the deaths. The flames came afterward. That distinction supported the prosecution's argument that the fire was deliberate. If someone had killed 4 people and then ignited the house, investigators could reasonably ask whether the fire was intended to destroy evidence. Prosecutors argued that this was precisely what had happened. The condition of the house also explained why investigators had to rely on multiple types of evidence. Fire can destroy objects, damage structures, and alter the appearance of a crime scene. Detectives, therefore, had to reconstruct events from whatever survived. One important category was surveillance evidence. The prosecution argued that the security system at Keith's property had been deliberately disabled. This detail mattered because it suggested preparation. A person who unexpectedly became involved in violence might act impulsively, but someone who first interfered with cameras could appear to be taking steps to avoid detection. Prosecutors linked that action to Paul. The defense disputed the state's interpretation and challenged the circumstances under which investigators had obtained certain surveillance evidence from Paul's property. That dispute had already traveled through the courts before trial, eventually reaching the New Jersey Supreme Court. The Supreme Court's decision allowed the contested evidence to be used, removing a major obstacle for the prosecution. For the jury, however, admissibility was only the beginning. They still had to decide what the evidence actually meant. The prosecution presented the surveillance material as part of a larger timeline. The state argued that Paul's movements and actions could be understood when viewed alongside the 2 fires, the damaged security system, and the physical evidence recovered during the investigation. The second fire was particularly important. Paul's home in Ocean Township had burned earlier that same morning. His wife and daughters were inside and survived. Prosecutors argued that this was not an accidental event, but another deliberate act connected to the killings in Colts Neck. The state suggested that the second fire served multiple purposes. It could destroy evidence associated with Paul's activities, while also creating the appearance that an unknown person was attacking members of the Caniro family. That theory was striking because it required Paul, according to prosecutors, to risk the lives of his own family members. The defense could use that fact to raise doubt. Why would someone attempting to conceal a crime deliberately endanger his wife and children? Why create another fire that could attract investigators? Why make the situation more complicated instead of simply leaving the area? The prosecution's answer was that the apparent recklessness was part of the deception. If investigators initially believed that someone was attacking multiple members of the family, Paul might appear to be another victim rather than a suspect. Whether that explanation was convincing became a matter for the jury. The financial evidence added another dimension. Prosecutors presented the relationship between the brothers as increasingly troubled. They described business disputes and financial tensions that allegedly gave Paul a reason to resent Keith. The state argued that Keith had become aware of financial problems and that Paul was under pressure. A substantial life insurance benefit was also relevant to the prosecution's theory. Prosecutors argued that approximately $1.5 million could ultimately be connected to Keith's death. The defense could point out that financial benefit alone does not establish murder. People can have financial interests in one another without becoming killers. The jury therefore had to consider the insurance evidence alongside the physical and surveillance evidence. The prosecution's argument depended on accumulation. A disabled security system might not prove murder. A financial dispute might not prove murder. A fire at Paul's house might not prove murder. A suspicious timeline might not prove murder. But prosecutors argued that these facts were not isolated. Together, they formed a pattern showing preparation, motive, opportunity, violence, and concealment. The defense's strategy was to break that pattern apart. If individual pieces of evidence could be explained in innocent ways, the defense could argue, then the entire prosecution theory might remain uncertain. The burden remained with the state. This was especially important because there was no surviving eyewitness who could simply walk into court and describe the murders. The victims could not tell investigators what happened. The jury, therefore, had to reconstruct the crime through circumstantial evidence. Circumstantial evidence can be powerful, but it requires careful interpretation. A financial record does not speak for itself. A camera recording does not necessarily explain intent. A fire scene does not automatically identify the person who started it. Investigators and prosecutors must connect those pieces through testimony and logic. That was exactly what the state attempted to do. The prosecution described a sequence beginning with the security system and leading to Keith's death. According to the state, Paul approached the property, neutralized surveillance, and confronted his brother. Keith was shot outside. The attack then moved inside, where Jennifer and the children were killed. Afterward, the house was set ablaze. Paul then allegedly returned to his own residence, where another fire was started. The state argued that the sequence was too specific to be accidental. The defense insisted that the prosecution had constructed a narrative around circumstantial evidence while failing to eliminate reasonable alternatives. As testimony continued, jurors were exposed to details that had been gathered years earlier. Investigators described the conditions at the properties. Forensic specialists explained the victims' injuries. Other witnesses and experts addressed financial records, surveillance evidence, and the circumstances surrounding the fires. The courtroom became a reconstruction of a morning that had occurred long before. For the families, hearing those details could only reopen the pain of November 2018. Every piece of evidence was connected to people they had known personally. Keith was not simply a name in a police report. Jennifer was not merely another homicide victim. Jesse and Sophia were children whose futures had been erased. The prosecution repeatedly returned to that human dimension. The defense, however, had a different responsibility. Its attorneys could acknowledge the horror of the crime while insisting that emotional impact could not substitute for proof. The question before the jury was not whether the murders were horrific. Everyone agreed that they were. The question was whether Paul Canairo was the person who committed them. That distinction defined the trial. As the evidence accumulated, the prosecution sought to make the timeline increasingly difficult to dispute. The state argued that Paul's connection to the financial conflict, his alleged movements, the security system, the two fires, and the forensic findings all pointed in the same direction. The defense continued challenging the interpretation of those facts. Eventually, the case would reach the point where both sides had presented their strongest arguments. The jurors would then have to leave the courtroom, review the evidence, and determine whether the state had met the highest burden required in a criminal trial. For Paul, the stakes could not have been greater. If convicted of the 4 murders, he could face life imprisonment for each victim. If the defense succeeded in creating reasonable doubt, the prosecution's theory could collapse. After more than 7 years of investigation, litigation, and delay, the fate of the case would soon depend on the deliberations of ordinary citizens. They had heard about a brother accused of killing his own brother. They had heard about a mother and 2 children allegedly killed because they were inside the home. They had heard about 2 fires occurring within the same family. They had heard about money, business conflict, surveillance, and forensic evidence. Now they had to decide whether all of those pieces formed a proven crime. The answer would arrive after deliberation, and when it did, it would finally determine whether the Canairo family massacre would end in acquittal, conviction, or another chapter of uncertainty. The next stage would bring the jury's decision and reveal whether prosecutors had successfully convinced them that Paul Canairo was responsible for the deaths of Keith, Jennifer, Jesse, and Sophia. After years of investigation, legal arguments, delays, and uncertainty, the Canairo case finally reached the moment when the evidence would be placed entirely in the hands of a jury. The trial had reconstructed a terrible morning in November 2018, when Keith Canairo, his wife Jennifer, and their 2 children, Jesse and Sophia, were killed in their Colts Neck home. Prosecutors had presented the murders as the final stage of a financial and family conflict, while the defense maintained that the evidence did not prove Paul Canairo was responsible. Now the jurors had to decide which interpretation was supported by the evidence. The prosecution had spent the trial building a case based largely on circumstances rather than a single piece of evidence that independently established guilt. The state pointed to the relationship between Paul and Keith, the alleged financial disagreements between the brothers, the surveillance evidence, the 2 fires, Paul's movements, and the forensic findings from the Colts Neck property. Prosecutors argued that these facts could not reasonably be separated from one another. In their view, they represented different parts of one deliberate plan. The defense attempted to do exactly the opposite. Rather than allowing the jurors to see the evidence as one connected sequence, defense attorneys challenged the individual links. They questioned the interpretation of surveillance material, disputed the prosecution's financial theory, and argued that investigators had focused on Paul while failing to eliminate other possibilities. The burden, however, remained with the prosecution. Paul Canairo did not have to prove that someone else committed the murders. He did not have to provide an alternative explanation that satisfied every unanswered question. The state had to establish his guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. That principle was especially important in a case involving circumstantial evidence. The jurors had heard about the condition of the Colts Neck home after the fire. They had heard how investigators determined that the deaths had resulted from violence rather than the fire itself. Keith had been shot, and Jennifer and the children had suffered fatal injuries involving gunfire and stabbing. They had also heard about the security system. According to prosecutors, someone had interfered with the surveillance equipment before the killings. The state argued that this demonstrated preparation and an intention to avoid being recorded. The prosecution connected that alleged action to Paul and presented it as one part of a broader sequence. The defense challenged the significance of the evidence, reminding jurors that suspicious circumstances must still be interpreted carefully. A jury cannot convict someone merely because investigators believe a particular explanation is likely. The evidence must meet the criminal standard of proof. The financial allegations were similarly important. The prosecution described a relationship between 2 brothers that had become increasingly strained by money and business. Prosecutors argued that Paul had reasons to resent Keith, and that Keith's death could provide Paul with a substantial financial benefit. The alleged insurance benefit was presented as another possible motive. But motive was not the same as proof of action. A person can have a financial motive without committing a murder. A person can benefit from another person's death without causing it. The jurors, therefore, had to determine whether the financial evidence was merely suggestive or whether it formed part of a much larger pattern that connected Paul directly to the killings. Then there were the fires. The fire at Paul's Ocean Township home was one of the most unusual elements of the case. Paul's wife and daughters had been inside when the blaze began, yet they survived. Prosecutors argued that Paul deliberately set the fire as part of an effort to create the impression that an unknown attacker was targeting the Canaro family. The defense challenged that theory by emphasizing the risk involved. If someone wanted to conceal for murders, deliberately setting fire to his own occupied residence would appear extraordinarily dangerous. But the prosecution maintained that the apparent danger was precisely what made the deception effective. If Paul's own family had also been endangered, investigators might initially view him as another victim rather than as a suspect. The jurors had to decide whether that explanation was reasonable. The two fires were also important because of their timing. The Ocean Township blaze occurred before the devastating fire at Keith's Colts Neck property. Investigators had spent years trying to reconstruct the movements of the person they believed had been responsible. The prosecution argued that the timeline was consistent with Paul traveling between the two locations and carrying out separate stages of the alleged plan. The defense argued that the timeline did not necessarily prove criminal conduct. Again, the issue was interpretation. The jury had to examine the evidence without the benefit of hindsight. Investigators had known what happened eventually, but the jurors had to ask what the evidence proved rather than what it appeared to suggest after the entire story had been assembled. This distinction can be difficult in a complex criminal trial. When many suspicious facts point in the same direction, they can create a powerful impression. But jurors are instructed to consider whether the combined evidence establishes guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, not merely whether the prosecution's explanation seems more convincing than the defense's. The Canaro case placed that responsibility directly before them. The victims remained central to the deliberations. Keith was not simply a businessman involved in a financial dispute. He was a husband and father. Jennifer was not simply a person found inside a burned house. She was a mother. Jesse and Sophia were children. The prosecution emphasized the human consequences of the crime, but the jury also had to remain focused on the legal question concerning Paul's responsibility. The horror of the murders could not itself establish who committed them. The jurors, therefore, had to separate emotion from evidence. After the attorneys completed their arguments and the judge provided the legal instructions, the jury began deliberating. For the Canaro family, this was another moment of waiting. More than 7 years had passed since the murders. During that time, the case had moved through investigations, hearings, appeals, evidentiary disputes, and pandemic-related delays. The families had waited for an opportunity to see whether the person accused of destroying their loved ones would ultimately be held responsible. Paul faced the possibility of spending the rest of his life in prison. The prosecution faced the possibility that the jury could reject its interpretation of the evidence. The defense faced the challenge of convincing jurors that reasonable doubt remained after years of investigation. The deliberations did not last for an extended period. On February 13, 2026, the jury returned with its decision. Paul Canaro was found guilty on all 15 counts presented against him. The verdict represented a dramatic turning point in the case. The jury had accepted the prosecution's central argument that Paul was responsible for the murders and related offenses. The conviction included 4 counts of first-degree murder involving Keith, Jennifer, Jesse, and Sophia. For the families of the victims, the verdict could not restore what had been lost. No legal decision could return a husband to his wife, parents to their children, or a brother to his surviving relatives. But the verdict answered the central legal question that had remained unresolved since 2018. Paul Canaro was no longer simply an accused man. He was a convicted murderer. The verdict also validated the prosecution's broader interpretation of the evidence. The financial conflict, the surveillance evidence, the fires, and the forensic findings had been presented as parts of a single story. By finding Paul guilty, The jury concluded that the state had met its burden of proof. The defense, however, retained the ability to pursue legal remedies after the verdict. A conviction does not necessarily end every possible court proceeding. Attorneys can challenge aspects of a trial, argue about sentencing, or pursue appeals based on legal issues. Nevertheless, the immediate uncertainty had ended. The next question was punishment. Because Paul had been convicted of 4 first-degree murders, the sentencing phase carried enormous consequences. Prosecutors sought severe punishment for each victim, emphasizing the deliberate nature of the killings and the destruction of an entire family. The sentencing hearing would also give surviving relatives an opportunity to speak. Victim impact statements can provide a courtroom with something that evidence alone cannot fully communicate. They reveal the continuing consequences of a crime. Birthdays that will never be celebrated, holidays missing family members, empty bedrooms, photographs that become painful reminders, and the permanent absence of people who should still be alive. For the Canaro family, those losses were especially profound. Jesse and Sophia would never grow older. Jennifer would never see her children become adults. Keith would never return to the life he had built. The conviction could establish legal responsibility, but it could not repair the damage. On May 19, 2026, the case reached its sentencing stage. Paul Canaro received 4 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole for the 4 murders. Additional punishment was imposed for the other offenses connected to the case. The sentences ensured that the convictions for the 4 deaths would be treated as separate and devastating crimes rather than as one event carrying a single punishment. The final judgment also brought an extraordinary legal journey to its conclusion. What had begun with 2 house fires had eventually become a murder investigation centered on 1 family and 2 brothers. At the beginning, investigators had faced uncertainty. They had a burned residence, 4 dead people, another burned house, and a family relationship that demanded closer examination. Then came the evidence. The investigation uncovered the alleged financial conflict. Surveillance became important. The fires were analyzed. Forensic examinations established the violent nature of the deaths. Paul's actions and movements became part of the prosecution's reconstruction. The defense challenged the interpretation of that evidence. Courts debated whether investigators had legally obtained important material. Years passed. Finally, a jury heard the evidence and reached its conclusion. The Canaro case demonstrates how a complex homicide investigation can evolve over many years. It also illustrates the difference between suspicion and proof. Investigators may develop a theory early in a case, but that theory must survive forensic examination, legal challenges, and ultimately the scrutiny of a jury. For the Canaro family, the story ended in court, but the consequences continued beyond it. The house where Keith, Jennifer, Jesse, and Sophia had lived became forever associated with the mourning that destroyed their family. Their names became part of one of New Jersey's most disturbing modern homicide cases. And Paul Canaro, once Keith's brother and business associate, became the person legally responsible for the 4 deaths. The final verdict did not erase the unanswered emotional questions surrounding the tragedy. Why did a family disagreement reach such an extreme point? How could financial conflict become more important than the lives of an entire family? And at what point did an ordinary dispute become an irreversible decision? Those questions remain among the most haunting aspects of the case. Legally, however, the conclusion was definitive. The jury convicted Paul on all 15 counts, and the court later imposed 4 consecutive life sentences without parole for the 4 murders. The long investigation had reached its final chapter. But the story of the Canaro family would not be remembered only because of the conviction. It would also be remembered because 4 people who should have had decades ahead of them were suddenly gone, leaving behind relatives who would carry the consequences for the rest of their lives. The case began with fire. It ended with a verdict. Between those 2 moments was a 7-year journey through grief, suspicion, investigation, courtroom battles, and finally judgment. The conviction of Paul Canaro brought a formal conclusion to one of the most disturbing homicide cases in New Jersey, but the verdict did not make the story of the Canaro family any less complicated. By the time the courtroom proceedings ended, More than 7 years had passed since the morning when Keith Canairo, Jennifer Canairo, Jesse Canairo, and Sophia Canairo were killed. The investigation had begun with confusion, 2 devastating fires, and a family tragedy. It ended with a jury finding Paul responsible for the 4 murders and the court imposing 4 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. Yet a criminal case is never only about the moment a verdict is announced. Behind the legal language are people whose lives were permanently changed, investigators who spent years reconstructing events, attorneys who fought over evidence, and a community that watched an ordinary family tragedy become a case of murder, money, betrayal, and fire. The aftermath of the verdict therefore deserves attention because it reveals what remained after the courtroom finally became quiet. For the relatives of Keith and Jennifer, the conviction provided a measure of legal closure. For years, they had been forced to live with uncertainty while Paul Canairo remained accused rather than convicted. Every hearing could bring another delay. Every legal challenge could potentially change the direction of the case. The passage of time meant that memories of the victims became increasingly intertwined with the long process of prosecution. The verdict changed that uncertainty. The jury had considered the evidence and found Paul guilty of all 15 counts brought against him. 4 of those convictions were for first-degree murder. The remaining convictions involved offenses connected to the fires, weapons, and other conduct alleged by prosecutors. The decision confirmed that the jury accepted the prosecution's overall reconstruction of the events. According to that reconstruction, the murders were connected to financial conflict between Paul and Keith. Prosecutors argued that Paul had a motive involving money and business, that he took steps to avoid surveillance, that he killed Keith, Jennifer, Jesse, and Sophia, and that he then used fire to destroy evidence and create confusion. The conviction meant that the jury found this explanation persuasive beyond a reasonable doubt. For the defense, however, the verdict represented a profound loss. Paul had maintained his innocence regarding the murders, and his attorneys had spent years challenging the state's evidence. Their arguments had focused on whether the prosecution had interpreted circumstantial evidence correctly and whether important evidence had been obtained and presented in accordance with the law. The fact that the jury rejected those arguments did not mean that every question surrounding the case had disappeared. Appeals and post-conviction proceedings can continue after a guilty verdict, especially in a case involving complex constitutional and evidentiary disputes. But the central legal question had been answered. Paul Canairo was convicted. The sentencing that followed was severe. 4 consecutive life sentences without parole were imposed for the deaths of Keith, Jennifer, Jesse, and Sophia. The structure of the sentence reflected the fact that 4 separate lives had been taken. The sentence also ensured that Paul would never regain his freedom through ordinary parole eligibility. For surviving relatives, however, punishment could never equal the scale of the loss. There is no sentence that can restore a child to a parent. There is no prison term that can bring back a spouse. There is no verdict capable of returning an 8-year-old girl to her bedroom, an 11-year-old boy to his school, or a father to the family waiting for him at home. The legal system can determine responsibility and impose punishment. It cannot reverse death. That reality is particularly painful in cases involving children. Jesse and Sophia had been too young to understand the financial disputes that prosecutors said existed between the adults. Their lives had been defined by family, school, childhood routines, and the expectation of growing older. Instead, their names became permanently associated with a crime that shocked their community. Their deaths also made the prosecution's theory especially difficult to comprehend. Why would a dispute between adults result in the deaths of 2 children? The state's answer was that the children were inside the house and could have become witnesses. Whether that explanation fully satisfies the emotional questions of the surviving family is impossible to know. The aftermath also left the physical location of the tragedy with a permanent significance. The Colts Neck property had once been a family home. After the fire and the murders, it became a crime scene. Investigators examined its remains for evidence. Firefighters documented the destruction, and forensic specialists attempted to reconstruct what had happened before the flames consumed the structure. A home is normally associated with safety and privacy. In this case, the home became the place where an entire family was destroyed. The second property, Paul's home in Ocean Township, carried its own significance. It had been damaged by fire on the same morning, while Paul's wife and daughters were inside. Their survival prevented the tragedy from becoming even larger. The two fires remain one of the most striking aspects of the case. From the perspective of investigators, the fires could not be considered independently. Their timing, their connection to two brothers, and the circumstances surrounding them made them central to the prosecution's reconstruction. The state's theory was that the fires served a purpose beyond destruction. They were allegedly intended to eliminate evidence and create the appearance that an unknown attacker was targeting members of the Caniro family. That alleged strategy ultimately failed. Investigators connected the events. The evidence was preserved and examined. The financial relationship between the brothers was investigated. Surveillance evidence became the subject of legal arguments. Forensic findings established that the deaths were murders rather than accidental fire fatalities. Years later, the evidence reached a jury. The verdict demonstrated the importance of combining different forms of evidence in a complex investigation. There was no single photograph that captured the entire crime. There was no surviving victim who could describe every moment. There was no simple piece of evidence that independently answered every question. Instead, investigators and prosecutors relied on a mosaic of information. Financial records provided context. Surveillance evidence helped establish movements and activity. Forensic examinations established how the victims died. Fire investigations helped explain what happened to the properties. Witness testimony provided additional information. The relationship between the brothers supplied the background for the prosecution's motive theory. Each piece had limitations, but the prosecution argued that when viewed together, they created a coherent explanation. The jury ultimately agreed. The case also demonstrated how constitutional protections can influence even the most serious criminal investigations. Evidence cannot simply be used because investigators believe it is important. Police actions must comply with legal standards, and courts must determine whether evidence was obtained and preserved lawfully. The dispute over evidence from Paul's home eventually reached New Jersey's highest court. The court's decision allowed important material to remain available to prosecutors, helping clear the way for the eventual trial. Without that ruling, the trial might have looked very different. The legal process also demonstrated how slowly justice can sometimes move. The murders occurred in 2018. The conviction did not arrive until 2026. During those years, technology, legal procedures, court schedules, and the pandemic all affected the progress of the case. For the families, waiting was not an abstract legal inconvenience. It meant living for years without a final judgment. The passage of time can change a criminal case in other ways as well. Witness memories can fade. Evidence can become harder to interpret. People involved in the investigation can move on to other cases. Public attention can disappear and return. Yet the victims remain unchanged in the historical record. Keith remained 50. Jennifer remained 45. Jesse remained 11. Sophia remained 8. Their ages became frozen in time. The person convicted of killing them would continue to age, while their lives could only be remembered through photographs, memories, records, and the stories told by people who loved them. That contrast is one of the most painful realities of homicide. The aftermath also raises broader questions about the danger of financial disputes when they become deeply personal. Business disagreements are common. Families argue over money, ownership, responsibility, and trust. Most disputes never approach violence. The Caniro case became horrifying precisely because prosecutors alleged that a private conflict crossed an unimaginable boundary. Money, according to the prosecution, became more important than family. The conviction established the legal consequences of that alleged decision. Paul would spend the rest of his life in prison. But the case also demonstrated that motive can be complicated. Financial gain may explain why prosecutors believe a person acted, but understanding motive does not necessarily explain the emotional transformation that allows someone to commit extreme violence. That question remains particularly difficult when the accused and the victims are brothers. Keith and Paul had shared a family history long before they became business associates. They had grown up knowing each other. Yet their relationship ultimately became central to a case involving 4 deaths. The contrast between family connection and alleged betrayal gave the case much of its emotional power. The Canairo murders will likely continue to be studied as an example of how investigators can unravel a crime hidden behind fire and apparent confusion. The case began with 2 houses burning almost simultaneously, but investigators refused to treat the events as isolated accidents. They examined relationships, money, technology, physical evidence, and human behavior until the pieces began to form a larger picture. The final verdict did not answer every philosophical question surrounding the tragedy. It did answer the legal question. Paul Canairo was found guilty of killing Keith, Jennifer, Jesse, and Sophia. He was sentenced to 4 consecutive life terms without parole. The case was therefore no longer an unsolved mystery. The person responsible, according to the verdict, had been identified and punished. For the surviving relatives, the end of the trial marked not the end of grief, but the end of one particular kind of uncertainty. They no longer had to wonder what a jury would decide. They no longer had to wait for the state to determine whether the evidence was sufficient. They could begin remembering the victims separately from the courtroom. Keith as a brother, husband, and father. Jennifer as a wife and mother. Jesse as a boy whose childhood ended far too soon. Sophia as a young girl who never had the chance to grow up. Those identities matter because a true crime case can easily reduce people to names in a headline. Behind the crime scene photographs and courtroom testimony were 4 individual lives. The Canairo case ended with punishment, but its deepest legacy lies in the lives that were lost. A family home was destroyed. 4 people were killed. Another family narrowly escaped a fire. 2 brothers became central figures in a story that began with business conflict and ended in murder. And after more than 7 years, a jury finally delivered its answer. The courtroom could close the case, but it could not erase the morning of November 20th, 2018. That morning remains the dividing line between the life the Canairo family had before and the permanent absence that followed. The final chapter is therefore not really about Paul Canairo. It is about the 4 people whose lives ended, the relatives who survived them, and the investigation that sought to establish what happened when an ordinary family conflict allegedly turned into an extraordinary act of violence. The fire eventually went out. The investigation eventually ended. The trial eventually ended. But for those who loved Keith, Jennifer, Jesse, and Sophia, there was never going to be an ending in the ordinary sense. There would only be memory, absence, and the knowledge that the people they lost would never walk through that door again. The story of the Canairo family massacre does not end simply because the court reached a verdict. The conviction of Paul Canairo brought a legal conclusion to the case, but the questions surrounding the tragedy continue to explain why it became such a haunting chapter in New Jersey criminal history. 4 people were killed inside a family home. 2 properties were damaged by fire. A business relationship between brothers became central to the investigation, and prosecutors ultimately persuaded a jury that the violence was deliberate. Looking back at the case from its conclusion makes the original events seem almost impossible to comprehend. On November 20th, 2018, the Canairo family woke up to circumstances that would permanently change the lives of everyone connected to them. By the end of that day, Keith, Jennifer, Jesse, and Sophia were dead. Their home had been destroyed by fire, and investigators were beginning to uncover evidence suggesting that the flames were part of something much larger. The most disturbing element was the relationship between the accused and the victims. Paul was not a stranger who had somehow entered the lives of the Canairo family. He was Keith's brother. Their relationship had existed for decades before the murders, and their business connections meant that financial disagreements could become deeply personal. That combination of family and money became the foundation of the prosecution's explanation. According to prosecutors, the brothers' business relationship had deteriorated because of financial disagreements. The state argued that Paul had developed a motive to eliminate Keith and that the deaths of Jennifer and the children followed because they were present in the house. The prosecution then connected the alleged killings to the fires, arguing that the destruction was intended to conceal evidence and create confusion. The jury ultimately accepted that explanation. But understanding the case requires remembering that the prosecution's theory had to pass through several stages before it became a conviction. First came the investigation, then came the arrest. After that came years of litigation over evidence. Only eventually did a jury hear the complete argument and determine that the state had proven its case. The surveillance evidence illustrates that process particularly well. Investigators believed that security equipment connected to the properties could help establish what happened during the critical period. Prosecutors argued that the security system at Keith's residence had been disabled before the attack. They interpreted this as evidence of planning and familiarity with the property. Yet the legal system did not automatically accept every piece of evidence simply because investigators considered it important. Defense attorneys challenged how evidence had been obtained, particularly material associated with Paul's home after the fire. The dispute eventually reached the New Jersey Supreme Court. The court's decision allowed the contested evidence to be used, meaning the prosecution could present it during the eventual trial. That ruling demonstrated how a criminal investigation can continue long after the police have identified a suspect. Evidence can become the subject of constitutional arguments, appeals, and judicial review before a jury ever hears it. The Canaro case, therefore, became a legal story as well as a homicide investigation. The passage of time was another defining feature. The murders occurred in 2018, but the final conviction did not come until 2026. More than 7 years separated the crime from the verdict. During that period, the world changed, courts experienced extraordinary disruption during the COVID-19 pandemic, and the legal battle over evidence continued. For the victims' relatives, those years represented an enormous period of waiting. The public may move on from a crime after the initial headlines disappear, but families do not have that option. A birthday still arrives. A holiday still arrives. A school year still begins. An empty room remains empty. Photographs preserve faces at particular ages while the surviving relatives continue to grow older. For Jesse and Sophia, time has a particularly cruel quality. Jesse was 11 when he died. Sophia was 8. Their ages remain permanently attached to their names. They never experienced adolescence, adulthood, careers, relationships, or the ordinary changes that make up a long human life. Jennifer also remains frozen in the historical record at 45. Keith remains 50. The conviction could not change any of that. What it could do was establish responsibility in the legal system. The February 2026 verdict was therefore significant not because it changed the past, but because it resolved the central question that had remained open since the murders. After hearing the evidence, the jury found Paul guilty on all 15 counts. That verdict represented the culmination of years of work by investigators and prosecutors. It also reflected the jury's conclusion that the evidence, considered as a whole, established guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. The sentence followed several months later. On May 19, 2026, Paul received 4 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole for the murders of Keith, Jennifer, Jesse, and Sophia. Additional punishment was imposed for other offenses connected to the case. For consecutive life sentences are a powerful expression of the court's recognition that 4 individual lives had been taken. Each victim was treated as a separate human being rather than as one part of a single criminal event. For the surviving family, however, punishment remains different from justice in an emotional sense. A prison sentence cannot repair a family photograph. It cannot return a child to school. It cannot restore a marriage. It cannot undo the last moments of 4 lives. This is why homicide cases often continue long after the legal process has ended. The court can declare what happened according to the evidence and impose a sentence, but grief follows a different timeline. The Canaro case also illustrates how ordinary disputes can become significant in retrospect. Financial disagreements are not unusual. Business partnerships can become strained. Brothers can disagree about money. Most such conflicts remain disagreements. What made this case so extraordinary was the prosecution's allegation that the conflict crossed a line that should never be crossed. According to the state's theory, financial interests eventually became connected to a decision to kill. The alleged plan then expanded to include Jennifer and the children and was followed by fires intended to conceal what had happened. The conviction established that the jury believed this interpretation. Still, the case should not be reduced to a simple warning about money. The evidence presented at trial described a complicated chain of relationships and actions. Motive, opportunity, surveillance, forensic evidence, financial records, and the circumstances of the fires all had to be considered together. That is one reason the investigation lasted so long. Investigators were not simply trying to determine whether someone had died. They were reconstructing an entire sequence after a fire had damaged the primary crime scene. They had to determine how the victims died, when they died, what happened before the flames, who had access to the property, and whether the second fire was connected. The investigation also demonstrated the value of refusing to accept the first apparent explanation. A fire can initially look like an accident. Two fires can look like unrelated disasters. A family disagreement can look like an ordinary private problem. But when those events occur within the same narrow period and involve the same family, investigators have to examine the connections. That process transformed the case. The first fire raised questions. The second fire raised more questions. The 4 deaths transformed those questions into a homicide investigation. The financial relationship between the brothers provided a possible motive. The surveillance evidence provided another potential connection. The forensic findings established that the victims had been killed before the fire. The court battles determined what evidence could ultimately be presented, and the jury supplied the final legal judgment. Each stage mattered. Without the initial investigation, there would have been no prosecution. Without the forensic work, the deaths might have been misunderstood. Without the financial investigation, the alleged motive would have remained unclear. Without the surveillance evidence, the timeline might have been harder to establish. Without the legal proceedings, the evidence could not have been tested. And without the jury, there could have been no verdict. The case therefore represents a long chain in which each stage depended on the previous one. For the community of Colts Neck, the crime also changed the meaning of a familiar landscape. A quiet residential road became associated with one of the most horrific crimes in the area's history. The image of a large home destroyed by flames became inseparable from the knowledge that 4 members of a family had been murdered there. For people who lived nearby, the case was a reminder that devastating violence does not always announce itself. A neighborhood can appear peaceful while private conflicts develop behind closed doors. For investigators, the case demonstrated another difficult truth. Some crimes are not solved through one dramatic discovery. They are solved by accumulating hundreds of smaller facts and determining whether those facts point toward the same conclusion. The Cairo investigation followed that pattern. The final verdict did not mean that every person involved experienced the same sense of closure. Some relatives may find relief in the conviction. Others may continue to struggle with anger, grief, or unanswered personal questions. A legal conclusion can be definitive while emotional healing remains incomplete. That difference is important when remembering the victims. Keith should not be remembered only as a murder victim. Jennifer should not be remembered only as a woman killed inside a burning home. Jesse should not be remembered only as an 11-year-old victim. Sophia should not be remembered only as an 8-year-old victim. They were members of a family with routines, relationships, memories, hopes, and ordinary moments that existed before the crime. The tragedy became famous because of what happened to them, but their lives existed before the headlines. That is perhaps the most important perspective to preserve. The Cairo case is often described through its shocking elements. The 2 fires, the multiple killings, the family connection, the alleged financial motive, and the eventual conviction. Those details explain why the investigation attracted so much attention. But beneath them is a simpler truth. 4 people died. One family was permanently broken. Another family survived a terrifying fire. And a criminal investigation spent years trying to determine why. The answer accepted by the jury was that Paul Cairo was responsible. The sentence ensured that he would remain in prison for the rest of his life. Yet the final measure of the tragedy cannot be found in the length of a sentence. It can be found in everything that will never happen because Keith, Jennifer, Jesse, and Sophia are gone. There will be no future family gatherings with all 4 of them present. No new photographs, No ordinary arguments followed by reconciliation. No birthdays celebrated together. No chance for Jesse and Sophia to become adults and remember their childhood. That absence is permanent. The courtroom has closed. The evidence has been argued. The verdict has been delivered. The sentence has been imposed. But the memory of the Canairo family remains beyond the legal record, carried by the people who knew them and by a community that will remember the November morning when an ordinary home became the center of an extraordinary crime. The case began with fire and confusion. It continued through suspicion, investigation, financial questions, forensic analysis, and years of legal battles. It ended with conviction and 4 consecutive life sentences. Yet the deepest lesson of the tragedy is not found in the final punishment. It is found in the devastating distance between an ordinary family life and the unimaginable violence that prosecutors said grew from conflict over money and business. For those left behind, that distance can never truly be explained, and perhaps that is why the Canairo case remains so difficult to forget. It was not a distant crime involving strangers. It was a tragedy that emerged from a family relationship, unfolded inside a family home, and left 4 names permanently connected to one of the darkest mornings in New Jersey. The investigation is over. The verdict is final unless changed through later legal proceedings. But the lives of Keith, Jennifer, Jesse, and Sophia remain the part of the story that should never be forgotten. The Canairo case ended in a courtroom, but its meaning reaches far beyond the final sentence imposed on Paul Canairo. By the time the legal process concluded, more than 7 years had passed since Keith Canairo, his wife Jennifer, and their children, Jesse and Sophia, were killed in their Colts Neck home. What began as a confusing sequence involving 2 fires became a major homicide investigation centered on family, money, business conflict, surveillance evidence, and alleged deception. The tragedy remains difficult to understand because the victims were not strangers to the person eventually convicted. Paul was Keith's brother. The 2 men shared a family history and business connections long before their names appeared together in a criminal case. Prosecutors argued that those connections became the source of a serious financial conflict and eventually provided the motive for murder. Keith was 50 years old when he died. Jennifer was 45. Jesse was 11, and Sophia was 8. Their ages are important because they show how much life remained ahead of them. The children had no role in the business disagreements described by prosecutors. They were simply inside their family home when the violence occurred. The case became particularly disturbing because the murders were followed by fire. Keith was found outside the residence with fatal gunshot wounds. Jennifer and the children were found inside. Investigators determined that the victims had suffered violent injuries before the fire, establishing that the blaze was not an accidental cause of death. That discovery changed everything. The investigators were no longer dealing with a tragic house fire. They were dealing with 4 murders and an apparent attempt to destroy the scene. At almost the same time, another Canairo residence in Ocean Township had also burned. Paul's wife and daughters had been inside that home and survived. 2 fires involving 2 brothers, occurring within the same period, immediately raised questions. Were they connected? Had someone deliberately targeted the family? Was one fire intended to conceal another crime? And why would Paul's own house burn while his family was inside? The prosecution eventually developed an explanation for these questions. According to the state's theory, Paul had a financial motive to eliminate Keith. Prosecutors argued that tensions over business and money had grown serious, and that Paul stood to benefit financially from Keith's death. They also pointed to a substantial life insurance benefit as part of the alleged motive. But motive alone could not prove murder. The prosecution therefore relied on a larger collection of evidence. One important element involved the security system at Keith's property. Prosecutors argued that surveillance equipment had been deliberately disabled before the attack. They presented this as evidence that the person responsible had prepared for the crime and wanted to avoid being recorded. The defense challenged the interpretation of this evidence and disputed the state's broader reconstruction. Paul maintained his innocence regarding the murders. His attorneys argued that investigators had connected circumstances in a way that did not necessarily prove criminal responsibility. That disagreement became especially important because the case depended heavily on circumstantial evidence. There was no surviving victim who could describe the attack. The main crime scene had been severely damaged by fire. Investigators, therefore, had to reconstruct events through forensic findings, surveillance material, financial records, witness information, and the movements of the people involved. Each piece had limitations. A financial record could suggest a dispute, but could not independently prove murder. A surveillance recording could show movement without revealing intent. A fire could demonstrate destruction without automatically identifying the person who caused it. The prosecution had to persuade jurors that the separate pieces formed one consistent explanation. The defense tried to separate those pieces and create reasonable doubt. The legal battle over evidence continued for years. One of the most important disputes involved material obtained from Paul's home after the fire. Defense attorneys challenged the legality of the search and seizure. The issue eventually reached the New Jersey Supreme Court, which ruled that the contested evidence could be used. That decision removed a major obstacle for prosecutors. Still, evidence being admissible did not make it automatically persuasive. The jury would have to decide what the evidence meant. The prosecution's final narrative was straightforward in its essential structure. Prosecutors alleged that Paul went to Keith's home, interfered with the security system, killed Keith outside, and then killed Jennifer and the children inside. They alleged that he set the Colts Neck house on fire before returning to his own residence, where he allegedly created another fire. The state argued that the second blaze could help make it appear that an unknown attacker was targeting the Canaro family. It could also destroy evidence and create confusion for investigators. The defense challenged that theory. One obvious question was why anyone trying to hide four murders would deliberately create a dangerous fire at his own occupied home. Paul's wife and daughters were inside, meaning the alleged plan exposed them to serious danger. The prosecution argued that the risk was part of the deception. The jury had to decide whether that explanation was more convincing than the alternatives offered by the defense. The financial theory was also tested. Prosecutors described business disagreements between the brothers and argued that money had become a powerful source of resentment. They presented the alleged insurance benefit as another possible reason Paul could have wanted Keith dead. Again, the defense could point out that financial benefit does not automatically establish intent to kill. A motive can exist without a crime occurring. The strength of the prosecution's case, therefore, depended on the combination of evidence. The jurors heard about the victim's injuries. They heard about the fires. They heard about the surveillance system. They heard about the financial relationship between the brothers. They heard the competing interpretations of Paul's movements and actions. Then they had to apply the highest standard used in a criminal trial. The result came on February 13, 2026. Paul Canaro was found guilty on all 15 counts. 4 of those convictions were for the first-degree murders of Keith, Jennifer, Jesse, and Sophia. The remaining convictions involved additional offenses connected to the case. The verdict was the moment when years of allegations and investigation became a formal judgment of criminal responsibility. Paul was no longer simply a suspect or defendant. He was a convicted murderer. Several months later, on May 19, 2026, the court imposed 4 consecutive life sentences without parole for the 4 murders, along with additional punishment for other offenses. The sentence reflected the fact that 4 separate lives had been lost. But punishment and healing are different things. A prison sentence can establish accountability. It can prevent a convicted person from returning to society. It can provide a formal answer to the question of responsibility. It cannot repair a family photograph, fill an empty bedroom, or restore a child's future. That distinction is especially powerful in the deaths of Jesse and Sophia. Jesse died at 11. Sophia died at 8. Those ages will never change. They represent the point at which their lives stopped, while everyone around them continued to grow older. Jennifer and Keith are similarly remembered at the ages they were when they died. Their lives had included years of relationships, work, family experiences, and ordinary moments that cannot be captured by a criminal file. This is why remembering the victims separately from the crime matters. A true crime investigation naturally focuses on evidence, suspects, motives, and verdicts. But those things describe how a crime is investigated, not who the victims were as human beings. The The Canairo case also demonstrates how investigators can uncover connections between events that initially appear unrelated. A house fire may be treated as an accident until another fire occurs nearby. A business dispute may appear private until it becomes relevant to a homicide. A disabled camera may seem like a technical detail until investigators place it within a timeline. The investigation required all of those details to be examined together. The legal record, therefore, provides a conclusion. Paul Canairo was convicted of killing 4 members of his brother's family and received 4 consecutive life sentences without parole. But the historical story is more than the judgment. It is the story of 4 people whose futures were taken away, leaving relatives and a community to carry their memory after the courtroom chapter ended. Their names remain at the center of the case because their lives, not the spectacle surrounding their deaths, are what should be remembered. The final legacy of the Canairo family case is shaped by 2 realities that exist at the same time. The first is legal. After years of investigation and litigation, Paul Canairo was convicted for the deaths of his brother Keith, Keith's wife Jennifer, and their children Jesse and Sophia. The second is human. No verdict, however decisive, can fully explain the emptiness left by 4 lives ending in a single morning. For that reason, the closing chapter of this story must return to where everything truly began, not with court documents or police theories, but with a family. Before November 20th, 2018, Keith and Jennifer were parents raising 2 children. Jesse and Sophia were growing up inside a home that should have represented safety. Their lives contained ordinary routines that never become news. Mornings, meals, school days, conversations, celebrations, disagreements, plans, and expectations for the future. Then one day separated their lives into before and after. The events of that morning were shocking because of their scale, but also because of the relationship at the center of the accusation. The man eventually convicted was not an unknown intruder. He was connected to the victims through blood and family history. Paul and Keith were brothers, and they were also connected through business. Prosecutors argued that financial conflict within that relationship became the motive behind an extraordinary act of violence. That allegation transformed an already terrible homicide into a story of betrayal. The investigation had to work backward from destruction. Fire had damaged Keith's home, making the reconstruction of events more difficult. Investigators first needed to establish a basic fact. The victims had not simply died in an accidental blaze. The medical and forensic evidence showed that violence had occurred before the fire. Keith had been fatally shot, while Jennifer and the children suffered fatal injuries. From there, detectives had to ask how the violence began and what happened afterward. The answer, according to prosecutors, involved planning. The state argued that security at Keith's home had been deliberately interfered with before the attack. It argued that Paul had a financial motive connected to disputes with Keith and potential financial benefits after his death. Prosecutors then placed the killings and the fire inside a broader sequence that included the separate blaze at Paul's own residence in Ocean Township. The second fire made the case even stranger. Paul's wife and daughters were inside that house and escaped. Prosecutors argued that the blaze was part of an effort to create confusion and support the appearance that the Canairo family was being targeted by someone else. The defense challenged the prosecution's interpretation, pointing to the dangers and unanswered questions within that theory. Yet investigators continued following the connections. They studied the timing of the fires. They examined the brothers' financial relationship. They reviewed surveillance information, physical evidence, witness accounts, and records capable of helping establish movements. The investigation became a process of assembling fragments. No single fragment told the whole story. That fact made the trial especially important. In a case based heavily on circumstantial evidence, the jury had to determine whether the individual pieces formed one convincing picture. The prosecution argued that they did. The defense argued that the pieces were being forced together and that reasonable doubt remained. This conflict continued through years of hearings and delays. The case was also shaped by legal arguments over evidence. Investigators responding to the emergency at Paul's home had obtained material that later became significant to the prosecution. Defense attorneys challenged whether some evidence had been lawfully obtained. Courts examined those questions before the case could move forward completely. Eventually, the legal system permitted the contested evidence to be presented. Only then could the full prosecution theory be tested before a jury. The passage of time made the eventual trial more significant. 7 years had passed since the killings. During those years, the victims' relatives lived with an unresolved criminal case while lawyers argued over procedure and evidence. The COVID-19 pandemic added further disruption to an already lengthy process. For families affected by homicide, time can create a difficult contradiction. Years may pass, but the original loss does not become historical in the same way for the people who knew the victims. The date remains important. A birthday arrives without the person whose birthday it is. A holiday exposes another absence. Children who once played together are remembered at the ages when they died, while their surviving friends and relatives grow older. Jesse remained 11. Sophia remained 8. Keith remained 50. Jennifer remained 45. The court could preserve their names, but it could not return their futures. When the jury finally received the Caniro case, it had to focus on one question above all others. Had prosecutors proved Paul's guilt beyond a reasonable doubt? The jury had heard the state's explanation of motive, preparation, violence, fire, and concealment. It had also heard the defense challenge the connections between those elements. The jurors were not asked whether the crime was horrifying. That was beyond dispute. They were asked whether the evidence proved that Paul Caniro had committed the crimes charged. On February 13, 2026, the answer was delivered. The jury found Paul Caniro guilty on all 15 counts. The verdict included 4 first-degree murder convictions for the deaths of Keith, Jennifer, Jesse, and Sophia. Other convictions addressed additional offenses connected to the case. For prosecutors, the decision represented the final acceptance of the theory they had built over years. For the defense, it marked a conviction after a long effort to challenge the state's evidence. For the victims' relatives, it provided a legal answer after years of uncertainty. But the verdict did not end the emotional consequences. A conviction establishes responsibility under the law. It does not establish a satisfying answer to every human question. People can still ask why. They can still struggle to understand how financial disputes, resentment, and family conflict could lead to such destruction. The court can determine what was proven. It cannot necessarily explain every private thought that preceded a crime. That may be the most unsettling part of this case. The prosecution offered a motive rooted in money and business conflict. The jury accepted the evidence supporting the prosecution's case. But motive, even when legally established, is not the same as emotional understanding. Knowing why investigators believed a crime occurred does not make the crime easier to comprehend. The victims therefore remain more important than the mystery surrounding the motive. Keith was more than a businessman involved in a dispute. Jennifer was more than a name on a charging document. Jesse was more than a child described by his age. Sophia was more than the youngest victim in a headline. They were people whose lives existed independently of the crime that later became associated with their names. Remembering that matters because the passage of time can change the way true crime stories are told. Cases become timelines. Victims become dates. A trial becomes a list of evidence. A sentence becomes the final number in a summary. But real loss does not exist as a summary. It exists in absence. It exists in the empty place at a table. It exists in photographs that cannot be updated. It exists in the memories that surviving relatives carry forward because the people they love cannot create new ones. The sentence imposed on Paul reflected the number of lives lost. On May 19, 2026, he received 4 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole for the murders, along with additional punishment for other offenses. The court treated the deaths as 4 separate crimes against 4 separate people. That distinction was important. A multiple homicide can sometimes be described as a single event, but the consequences are never singular. Keith's death was not Jennifer's death. Jennifer's death was not Jesse's death. Jesse's death was not Sophia's death. Each person had a separate life, a separate relationship with the people who survived, and a separate future that was taken away. 4 life sentences reflected that reality in legal form. The broader lesson of the Canairo case is not that every family or business dispute contains hidden violence. Most do not. Its lesson is more limited and more disturbing. Investigators must take complex connections seriously when violence occurs, even when the circumstances initially appear confusing. The 2 fires could have remained separate mysteries. The financial conflict could have remained a private disagreement. The damaged security system could have remained a technical detail. But investigators compared those facts rather than viewing them alone. They searched for patterns, tested explanations, preserved evidence, and submitted their conclusions to the legal process. That process was slow. It was challenged repeatedly. It required years. Yet it eventually produced a verdict. The case also demonstrates why criminal justice is often measured in patience as much as speed. A rapid accusation without sufficient evidence can fail. A thorough investigation can take time, especially when the crime scene has been damaged and constitutional questions arise over evidence. For the Canairo family, however, the years of waiting were themselves another burden. Justice delayed may still arrive, but time cannot be returned to the people who spent those years waiting for an answer. The final answer from the jury was clear. Paul Canairo was guilty. The final punishment was severe. He would spend the rest of his life in prison without the possibility of parole. Legally, that brought the central prosecution to its conclusion. Emotionally, there could never be an equivalent conclusion. The people who loved Keith, Jennifer, Jesse, and Sophia must continue living with their absence. The community must remember that a quiet neighborhood once became the center of extraordinary violence. The surviving relatives must carry memories that no court can rewrite. And that is where the story should end. Not with the defendant's name, not with the flames, not with the courtroom. It should end with the 4 people whose lives were taken. Keith Canairo, Jennifer Canairo, Jesse Canairo, Sophia Canairo. Their names are the reason the investigation began, the reason evidence was collected, the reason prosecutors pursued charges, and the reason a jury spent its time examining a tragedy years after it occurred. The case will continue to be remembered because of its shocking details. 2 fires for murders, a family connection, financial allegations, and years of courtroom battles. But those details are only the structure surrounding the central loss. For people entered November 20th, 2018, with lives still moving forward. They did not leave it alive. The legal system eventually identified and convicted the person the jury found responsible. It imposed a punishment designed to ensure that he would never return to ordinary freedom. Nothing more could be done to change the past. Perhaps that is the final truth behind every solved homicide case. A conviction can answer who. It can sometimes answer how. It may provide a legally accepted explanation for why. But it cannot undo. It cannot restore. It cannot make the last day disappear. The fire can be extinguished. The evidence can be cataloged. The arguments can end. The jury can return. The judge can impose sentence. Yet the people who were lost remain lost. That is the final weight of the Canairo family massacre. After the investigation, after the trial, and after the punishment, what remains is memory. And for Keith, Jennifer, Jesse, and Sophia, memory is now the only future left. The investigation is over. The verdict has been delivered. The sentence has been imposed. Yet the people who were lost remain at the center of the story. Keith, Jennifer, Jesse, and Sophia are more than victims in a legal record. They are the reason the case mattered. Their memory remains after every argument, ruling, and headline has faded. If this story continues, the strongest next step is a seamless documentary narrative that connects every chapter and removes repeated details completely.